Introduction. Elephant in the room, N. An important issue that people are reluctant to acknowledge or address, a social taboo. Elephant in the brain, N. An important but unacknowledged feature of how our minds work, an introspective taboo. Robin caught his first glimpse of the elephant in 1998. He had recently finished his doctoral work at Caltech, studying abstract economic theory, and was beginning a 2-year postdoc focused on healthcare policy. At first, he concentrated on the standard questions: which medical treatments are effective? Why do hospitals and insurance companies operate the way they do? And how can the whole system be made more efficient? As he immersed himself in the literature, however, he started noticing data that didn't add up, and soon he began to question even the most basic, bedrock assumptions. Why do patients spend so much on medical care? To get healthier, that's their one and only goal, right? Maybe not. Consider some of the puzzling data points that Robin discovered. To start with, people in developed countries consume way too much medicine, doctor visits, drugs, diagnostic tests, and so forth, well beyond what's useful for staying healthy. Large randomized studies, for example, find that people given free healthcare consume a lot more medicine, yet don't end up noticeably healthier. Meanwhile, non-medical interventions, such as efforts to alleviate stress or improve diet, exercise, sleep, or air quality, have a much bigger apparent effect on health, and yet patients and policymakers are far less eager to pursue them. Patients are also easily satisfied with the appearance of good medical care, and show shockingly little interest in digging beneath the surface, for example, by getting second opinions or asking for outcome statistics from their doctors or hospitals. One astonishing study found that only 8% of patients about to undergo a dangerous heart surgery were willing to pay $50 to learn the different death rates for that very surgery at nearby hospitals. Finally, people spend exorbitantly on heroic end-of-life care, even though cheap, palliative care is usually just as effective at prolonging life and even better at preserving quality of life. Altogether, these puzzles cast considerable doubt on the simple idea that medicine is strictly about health. To explain these and other puzzles, Robin took an approach unusual among health policy experts. He suggested that people might have other motives for buying medicine, motives beyond simply getting healthy, and that these motives are largely unconscious. On introspection, we see only the health motive, but when we step back and triangulate our motives from the outside, reverse engineering them from our behaviors, a more interesting picture begins to develop. When a toddler stumbles and scrapes his knee, his mom bends down to give it a kiss. No actual healing takes place, and yet both parties appreciate the ritual. The toddler finds comfort in knowing his mom is there to help him, especially if something more serious were to happen. And the mother, for her part, is eager to show that she's worthy of her son's trust. This small, simple example shows how we might be programmed both to seek and give healthcare even when it isn't medically useful. Robin's hypothesis is that a similar transaction lurks within our modern medical system, except we don't notice it because it's masked by all the genuine healing that takes place. In other words, expensive medical care does heal us, but it's simultaneously an elaborate adult version of kiss the boo-boo. In this transaction, the patient is assured of social support, while those who provide such support are hoping to buy a little slice of loyalty from the patient. And it's not just doctors who are on the kissing or supportive side of the transaction, but everyone who helps the patient along the way: the spouse who insists on the doctor's visit, the friend who watches the kids, the boss who's lenient about work deadlines, and even the institutions, like employers and national governments, that sponsored the patient's health insurance in the first place. Each of these parties is hoping for a bit of loyalty in exchange for their support. But the net result is that patients end up getting more medicine than they need strictly for their health. The conclusion is that medicine isn't just about health, it's also an exercise in conspicuous caring. Now, we don't expect our readers to believe this explanation just yet. We'll examine it in more detail in Chapter 14. What's important is getting a feel for the kind of explanation we're proposing. First, we're suggesting that key human behaviors are often driven by multiple motives, even behaviors that seem pretty single-minded, like giving and receiving medical care. This shouldn't be too surprising. Humans are complex creatures, after all. But second, and more importantly, we're suggesting that some of these motives are unconscious. We're less than fully aware of them. And they aren't mere mouse-sized motives, scurrying around discreetly in the back recesses of our minds. These are elephant-sized motives large enough to leave footprints in national economic data. Thus, medicine was Robin's first glimpse of the elephant in the brain. Kevin, meanwhile, caught his first glimpse while working at a software startup in Silicon Valley. Initially, Kevin took the startup scene for a straightforward exercise in company building. Gather some people together, give them time to think, talk, and write code, and eventually, like Legos clicking into place, out pops useful software. Then he read Hierarchy in the Forest by anthropologist Christopher Bohm, a book that analyzes human societies with the same concepts used to analyze chimpanzee communities. After reading Bohm's book, Kevin began to see his environment very differently. An office full of software engineers soon morphed, under the flickering fluorescent lights, into a tribe of chattering primates. All-hands meetings, shared meals, and team outings became elaborate social grooming sessions. Interviews began to look like thinly veiled initiation rituals. The company logo took on the character of a tribal totem or religious symbol. But the biggest revelation from Bohm's book concerned social status. Of course, office workers, being primates, are constantly jockeying to keep or improve their position in the hierarchy, whether by dominance displays, squabbles over territory, or active confrontations. None of these behaviors is surprising to find in a species as social and political as ours. What's interesting is how people obfuscate all this social competition by dressing it up in clinical business jargon. Richard doesn't complain about Karen by saying, "She gets in my way." He accuses her of not caring enough about the customer. Taboo topics like social status aren't discussed openly, but are instead swaddled in euphemisms like experience or seniority. The point is, people don't typically think or talk in terms of maximizing social status, or, in the case of medicine, showing conspicuous care. And yet we all instinctively act this way. In fact, we're able to act quite skillfully and strategically, pursuing our self-interest without explicitly acknowledging it, even to ourselves. But this is odd. Why should we be less than fully conscious of such important motives? Biology teaches us that we're competitive social animals, with all the instincts you'd expect from such creatures. And consciousness is useful, that's why it evolved. So shouldn't it stand to reason that we'd be hyperconscious of our deepest biological incentives? And yet, most of the time, we seem almost woefully unaware of them. It's not that we're literally incapable of perceiving these motives within our psyches. We all know they're there. And yet they make us uncomfortable, so we mentally flinch away. The core idea. We are social creatures to the inmost center of our being. Karl Popper 1. Every man alone is sincere. At the entrance of a second person, hypocrisy begins. Ralph Waldo Emerson 2. Here is the thesis we'll be exploring in this book. We, human beings, are a species that's not only capable of acting on hidden motives, we're designed to do it. Our brains are built to act in our self-interest while at the same time trying hard not to appear selfish in front of other people. And in order to throw them off the trail, our brains often keep us, our conscious minds, in the dark. The less we know of our own ugly motives, the easier it is to hide them from others. Self-deception is therefore strategic, a ploy our brains use to look good while behaving badly. Understandably, few people are eager to confess to this kind of duplicity. But as long as we continue to tiptoe around it, we'll be unable to think clearly about human behavior. We'll be forced to distort or deny any explanation that harks back to our hidden motives. Key facts will remain taboo, and we'll forever be mystified by our own thoughts and actions. It's only by confronting the elephant, then, that we can begin to see what's really going on. Again, it's not that we're completely unaware of our unsavory motives, far from it. Many are readily apparent to anyone who chooses to look. For each hidden motive that we discuss in the book, some readers will be acutely aware of it, some dimly aware, and others entirely oblivious. This is why we've chosen the elephant as our metaphor. The elephant, whether in a room or in our brains, simply stands there, out in the open, and can easily be seen if only we steel ourselves to look in its direction. But generally, we prefer to ignore the elephant, and as a result, we systematically give short shrift to explanations of our behavior that call attention to it. Box 1. The elephant. So what, exactly, is the elephant in the brain, this thing we're reluctant to talk and think about? In a word, it's selfishness, the selfish parts of our psyches. But it's actually broader than that. Selfishness is just the heart, if you will, and an elephant has many other parts, all interconnected. So throughout the book, we'll be using the elephant to refer not just to human selfishness, but to a whole cluster of related concepts. The fact that we're competitive social animals fighting for power, status, and sex. The fact that we're sometimes willing to lie and cheat to get ahead. The fact that we hide some of our motives, and that we do so in order to mislead others. We'll also occasionally use the elephant to refer to our hidden motives themselves. To acknowledge any of these concepts is to hint at the rest of them. They're all part of the same package, subject to the same taboo. Figure 1. The elephant in the brain. Human behavior is rarely what it seems. That's the main lesson here. Of course, we're hardly the first people to make this point. Thinkers across the ages have delighted in identifying many ways, large and small, that our actions don't seem to align with our supposed reasons. We should often blush at our noblest deeds, wrote François de la Rochefoucauld in the 17th century, if the world were to see all their underlying motives. 3. Sigmund Freud, of course, was a major champion of hidden motives. He posited a whole suite of them, along with various mechanisms for keeping them unconscious. But although the explanations in this book may seem Freudian at times, we follow mainstream cognitive psychology in rejecting most of Freud's methods and many of his conclusions. Repressed thoughts and conflict within the psyche? Sure, those are at the heart of our thesis. But the Oedipus complex? Dreams as a reliable source of evidence? Memories from the womb uncovered during psychoanalysis? None of these will play a role in our story. Instead, we start closer to evolutionary psychology, drawing from scholars like Robert Travers and Robert Kurzban, along with Robert Wright. Yes, they're all Roberts, who have written clearly and extensively about self-deception from a Darwinian perspective. The human brain, according to this view, was designed to deceive itself, in Travers' words, the better to deceive others. We start with evolutionary psychology, but we don't end there. We continue to seek hidden motives at larger social levels, taking inspiration from Thorstein Veblen, an economist and sociologist writing roughly a century ago. Veblen famously coined the term conspicuous consumption to explain the demand for luxury goods. When consumers are asked why they bought an expensive watch or high-end handbag, they often cite material factors like comfort, aesthetics, and functionality. But Veblen argued that, in fact, the demand for luxury goods is driven largely by a social motive, flaunting one's wealth. More recently, the psychologist Jeffrey Miller has made similar arguments from an evolutionary perspective, and we draw heavily from his work as well. Our aim in this book, therefore, is not just to catalog the many ways humans behave unwittingly, but also to suggest that many of our most venerated institutions, charities, corporations, hospitals, universities, serve covert agendas alongside their official ones. Because of this, we must take covert agendas into account when thinking about these institutions, or risk radically misunderstanding them. What will emerge from this investigation is a portrait of the human species as strategically self-deceived, not only as individuals, but also as a society. Our brains are experts at flirting, negotiating social status, and playing politics, while we, the self-conscious parts of the brain, manage to keep our thoughts pure and chaste. We don't always know what our brains are up to, but we often pretend to know, and therein lies the trouble. The basic argument. At least 4 strands of research all lead to the same conclusion, that we are, as the psychologist Timothy Wilson puts it, strangers to ourselves. 1. Microsociology. When we study how people interact with each other on the small scale, in real time and face-to-face, we quickly learn to appreciate the depth and complexity of our social behaviors and how little we're consciously aware of what's going on. These behaviors include laughter, blushing, tears, eye contact, and body language. In fact, we have such little introspective access into these behaviors, or voluntary control over them, that it's fair to say we aren't really in charge. Our brains choreograph these interactions on our behalves, and with surprising skill. While we anguish over what to say next, our brains manage to laugh at just the right moments, flash the right facial expressions, hold or break eye contact as appropriate, negotiate territory and social status with our posture, and interpret and react to all these behaviors in our interaction partners. 2. Cognitive and social psychology. The study of cognitive biases and self-deception has matured considerably in recent years. We now realize that our brains aren't just hapless and quirky, they're devious. They intentionally hide information from us, helping us fabricate plausible prosocial motives to act as cover stories for our less savory agendas. As Travers puts it, at every single stage, from its biased arrival, to its biased encoding, to organizing it around false logic, to misremembering and then misrepresenting it to others, the mind continually acts to distort information flow in favor of the usual goal of appearing better than one really is. Emily Pronine calls it the introspection illusion, the fact that we don't know our own minds nearly as well as we pretend to. For the price of a little self-deception, we get to have our cake and eat it too, act in our own best interests without having to reveal ourselves as the self-interested schemers we often are. 3. Primatology. Humans are primates, specifically apes. Human nature is therefore a modified form of ape nature. And when we study primate groups, we notice a lot of Machiavellian behavior, sexual displays, dominance and submission, fitness displays, and political maneuvering. But when asked to describe our own behavior, why we bought that new car, say, or why we broke off a relationship, we mostly portray our motives as cooperative and prosocial. We don't admit to nearly as much showing off and political jockeying as we'd expect from a competitive social animal. Something just doesn't add up. 4. Economic puzzles. When we study specific social institutions, medicine, education, politics, charity, religion, news, and so forth, we notice that they frequently fall short of their stated goals. In many cases, this is due to simple execution failures, but in other cases, the institutions behave as though they were designed to achieve other, unacknowledged goals. Take school, for instance. We say that the function of school is to teach valuable skills and knowledge. Yet students don't remember most of what they're taught, and most of what they do remember isn't very useful. Furthermore, our best research says that schools are structured in ways that actively interfere with the learning process, such as early wake-up times and frequent testing. Again, something doesn't add up. This focus on large-scale social issues is, in fact, what most distinguishes our book. Plenty of other thinkers have examined self-deception in the context of our personal lives and individual behaviors, but few have taken the logical next step of using those insights to study our institutions. The point is, we act on hidden motives together, in public, just as often as we do by ourselves, in private. And when enough of our hidden motives harmonize, we end up constructing stable, long-lived institutions, like schools, hospitals, churches, and democracies that are designed, at least partially, to accommodate such motives. This was Robin's conclusion about medicine, and similar reasoning applies to many other areas of life. Here's another way to look at it. The world is full of people acting on motives they'd rather not acknowledge, but most of the time, opposing interest groups are eager to call them out for it. For example, when U.S. bankers angled for a bailout during the 2008 financial crisis, they argued that it would benefit the entire economy, conveniently neglecting to mention that it would line their own pockets. Thankfully, many others stood ready to accuse them of profiteering. Similarly, during the Bush administration, U.S. anti-war protesters, most of whom were liberal, justified their efforts in terms of the harms of war. And yet, when Obama took over as president, they drastically reduced their protests, even though the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan continued unabated. All this suggested an agenda that was more partisan than pacifist, and conservative critics were happy to point out the disconnect. 7. But what happens when our hidden motives don't line up with a tribal or partisan agenda? In areas of life in which we're all similarly complicit in hiding our motives, who will call attention to them? This book attempts to shine light on just those dark, unexamined facets of public life, venerated social institutions in which almost all participants are strategically self-deceived, markets in which both buyers and sellers pretend to transact one thing while covertly transacting another. The art scene, for example, isn't just about appreciating beauty. It also functions as an excuse to affiliate with impressive people and as a sexual display. Education isn't just about learning. It's largely about getting graded, ranked, and credentialed, stamped for the approval of employers. Religion isn't just about private belief in God or the afterlife, but about conspicuous public professions of belief that help bind groups together. In each of these areas, our hidden agendas explain a surprising amount of our behavior, often a majority. When push comes to shove, we often make choices that prioritize our hidden agendas over the official ones. This line of thinking suggests that many of our institutions are prodigiously wasteful. Under the feel-good veneer of win-win cooperation, teaching kids, healing the sick, celebrating creativity, our institutions harbor giant, silent furnaces of intergroup competitive signaling, where trillions of dollars of wealth, resources, and human effort are being shoveled in and burned to ash every year, largely for the purpose of showing off. Now, our institutions do end up achieving many of their official, stated goals, but they're often rather inefficient because they're simultaneously serving purposes no one is eager to acknowledge. This may sound like pessimism, but it's actually great news. However flawed our institutions may be, we're already living with them, and life, for most of us, is pretty good. So if we can accurately diagnose what's holding back our institutions, we may finally succeed in reforming them, thereby making our lives even better. Of course, not everyone cares about the design of large-scale social institutions. A more practical use for our book is to help readers develop better situational awareness. Whether in meetings, at church, or while watching politicians jabber on TV, we all want deeper insight into what's happening and why. Human social behavior is complex and often nearly inscrutable, but this book provides a framework for helping readers make sense of it, especially the parts that are otherwise counterintuitive. Why do people laugh? Who's the most important person in the room? Why are artists sexy? Why do so many people brag about travel? Does anyone really, truly believe in creationism? If we listen to what people say about themselves, we'll often be led astray, because people strategically misconstrue their motives. It's only by cross-examining these motives, using data about how people behave, that we're able to learn what's really driving human behavior. Box 2, our thesis in plain English. 1. People are judging us all the time. They want to know whether we'll make good friends, allies, lovers, or leaders. And one of the important things they're judging is our motives. Why do we behave the way we do? Do we have others' best interests at heart, or are we entirely selfish? 2. Because others are judging us, we're eager to look good. So we emphasize our pretty motives and downplay our ugly ones. It's not lying, exactly, but neither is it perfectly honest. 3. This applies not just to our words, but also to our thoughts, which might seem odd. Why can't we be honest with ourselves? The answer is that our thoughts aren't as private as we imagine. In many ways, conscious thought is a rehearsal of what we're ready to say to others. As Travers puts it, we deceive ourselves the better to deceive others. 8.4. In some areas of life, especially polarized ones like politics, we're quick to point out when others' motives are more selfish than they claim. But in other areas, like medicine, we prefer to believe that almost all of us have pretty motives. In such cases, we can all be quite wrong, together, about what drives our behavior. Trajectory of the book. The book is divided into 2 parts. Part 1, Why We Hide Our Motives, explores how the incentives of social life distort our minds, inducing awkward contortions of self-deception. Matthew 7 verse 3 asks, why worry about a speck in your friend's eye when you have a log in your own? In our metaphor, we might just as well ask, why worry about a mouse in your friend's mind when you have an elephant in your own? In Part 1, our goal is to confront the elephant as directly as possible, to stare it down, without blinking or flinching away. Part 2, Hidden Motives in Everyday Life, uses our new understanding of the elephant to deconstruct a wide range of human behaviors, both at the small, personal scale and in the context of our broadest institutions. What we'll find is that things are often not what they seem on the surface. A word of warning. For those of us who want to understand the world, it's unsettling to think our brains might be deceiving us. Reality is bewildering enough without an elephant clouding our vision. But the ideas in this book have an even more serious handicap, which is that they're difficult to celebrate publicly. Consider how some ideas are more naturally viral than others. When a theory emphasizes altruism, cooperation, and other feel-good motives, for example, people naturally want to share it, perhaps even shout it from the rooftops. By working together, we can achieve great things. It reflects well on both speakers and listeners to be associated with something so inspirational. This is the recipe for ideas that draw large audiences and receive standing ovations, the time-honored premise of sermons, TED Talks, commencement speeches, and presidential inaugurations. Many other ideas, however, face an uphill battle and may never achieve widespread acceptance. When an idea emphasizes competition and other ugly motives, people are understandably averse to sharing it. It sucks the energy out of the room. As your 2 co-authors have learned firsthand, it can be a real buzzkill at dinner parties. In light of this, it's important to emphasize where we're coming from. The line between cynicism and misanthropy, between thinking ill of human motives and thinking ill of humans, is often blurry. So we want readers to understand that although we may be skeptical of human motives, we love human beings. We aren't trying to put our species down or rub people's noses in their own shortcomings. We're just taking some time to dwell on the parts of human nature that don't get quite as much screen time. All in all, we doubt an honest exploration will detract much from our affection for these fine creatures. If we're being honest with ourselves, and true to the book's thesis, then we must admit there is a risk to confronting our hidden motives. Human beings are self-deceived because self-deception is useful. It allows us to reap the benefits of selfish behavior while posing as unselfish in front of others. It helps us look better than we really are. Confronting our delusions must therefore undermine their very reason for existing. There's a very real sense in which we might be better off not knowing what we're up to. But we see this choice of whether to look inward and confront the elephant or continue to avert our gaze as similar to the choice Morpheus offers Neo in The Matrix. After this, Morpheus warns, holding out a blue pill in one hand and a red pill in the other, there is no turning back. You take the blue pill, the story ends, you wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill, you stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. 9. If curiosity killed the cat, then Kevin and Robin would be dead cats. We just can't resist an offer like this. We choose the red pill and hope that you, dear reader, feel likewise. Part 1. Why we hide our motives. 1. Animal behavior. Before we get mired in the complexities of human social life, let's start at a simpler beginning. Because humans are an animal species, we can learn a lot about ourselves by studying other animals. In fact, it can be especially useful to study other species because we have fewer preconceptions about them. Think of it as a training wheels exercise, if you will. In this chapter, we're going to take a quick look at 2 animal behaviors that are hard to decipher. In each case, the animals appear to be doing something simple and straightforward, but as we dig below the surface, the same way we'll approach our own behavior in later chapters, we'll find extra layers of complexity. Note, however, that these non-human animals don't necessarily hide their motives like we do. Psychologically, if their motives seem cryptic, it's not because they're playing mind games. We'll discuss this in more detail at the end of the chapter. Social grooming. Let's start with grooming behavior among primates. While humans are relatively hairless, most other primates have thick fur all over their bodies. When left unchecked, this fur quickly becomes matted with dirt and debris. It also makes an attractive home for fleas, lice, ticks, and other parasites. As a result, primate fur needs periodic grooming to stay clean. Individual primates can groom themselves, but they can only effectively groom about half their bodies. They can't easily groom their own backs, faces, and heads. So to keep their entire bodies clean, they need a little help from their friends. This is called social grooming. Point 2. Picture 2 male chimpanzees engaged in an act of social grooming. One chimp, the groomee, sits hunched over, exposing his full backside. The other chimp, the groomer, crawls up and begins examining the first chimp's fur. He'll typically spend a few minutes scratching and picking at it with his fingers, using his opposable thumbs to pull out bits of stray matter. It's a purposeful activity that requires a good deal of attention and focus. If we could somehow ask the grooming chimp what he's doing, he might give a pragmatic explanation. I'm trying to remove these bits and pieces from my friend's back. That's the purpose of the activity and what his attention is focused on. He might also cite the logic of straightforward reciprocity. If I groom my friend's back, he's more likely to groom mine in return, which is true. Chimps form mutual grooming partnerships that are relatively stable over the course of their lives. At first blush, then, social grooming seems like an act of hygiene, a way to keep one's fur clean. This is far from the complete picture, however. We can't take social grooming at face value. There are some puzzling facts that cast doubt on the simple hygienic function. Most primates spend far more time grooming each other than necessary for keeping their fur clean. Gelada baboons, for example, devote a whopping 17% of their daylight hours to grooming each other. Clearly this is overkill, as some primate species spend only 0.1% of their time grooming each other, while birds spend maybe 0.01% of their time on similar preening behaviors. 5. Even more puzzling is the fact that primates spend a lot more time grooming each other than they spend grooming themselves. If the only purpose of grooming were hygiene, we'd expect to see more self-grooming in proportion to social grooming. Finally, we can correlate the average body size with the amount of time they spend grooming. If grooming were strictly a hygienic activity, we'd expect larger species, those with more fur, to spend more time grooming each other. But in fact, there's no correlation. Point 7. We might ask ourselves, what's going on here? There must be some other function at play. The primatologist Robin Dunbar has spent much of his career studying social grooming, and his conclusion has since become the consensus among primatologists. Social grooming, he says, isn't just about hygiene, it's also about politics. By grooming each other, primates help forge alliances that help them in other situations. An act of grooming conveys a number of related messages. The groomer says, I'm willing to use my spare time to help you, while the groomee says, I'm comfortable enough to let you approach me from behind. Meanwhile, both parties strengthen their alliance merely by spending pleasant time in close proximity. Two rivals, however, would find it hard to let their guards down to enjoy such a relaxed activity. 8. The bottom line, grooming, says Dunbar, creates a platform off which trust can be built. 9. This political function of grooming helps explain other data points that don't make sense according to the strictly hygienic function. For example, it explains why higher-ranked individuals receive more grooming than lower-ranked individuals. 10. When low-ranking primates choose to groom one of their superiors, they're less likely to be groomed in return, so they must be angling for some other kind of benefit. Indeed, grooming partners are more likely to share food. 11. Tolerate each other at feeding sites. 12. And support each other during confrontations with other members of the group. 13. The political function of grooming also explains why grooming time across species is correlated with the size of the social group, but not the amount of fur. 14. Larger groups have, on average, greater political complexity, making alliances more important but also harder to maintain. Note that these primates don't need to be conscious of their political motivations. As far as natural selection is concerned, all that matters is that primates who do more social grooming fare better than primates who do less. Primates are thereby endowed with instincts that make them feel good when they groom each other, without necessarily understanding why they feel good. 15. It's also important to note that there's still some role for hygiene in explaining why primates groom each other. If hygiene were completely irrelevant, primates would simply give each other back massages instead of picking through each other's fur. But even though there's some hygienic value to social grooming, it doesn't explain why primates spend so much time doing it. Gelada baboons, for example, might be able to keep their fur clean with only 30 minutes of social grooming every day, but instead they spend 120 minutes. Only politics explains why the geladas spend those additional, seemingly unnecessary 90 minutes. Competitive altruism. Before we move on to human behavior, here's one more quick example. The Arabian babbler, famously studied by Amat Zahavi and a team of ornithologists at Tel Aviv University, is a small brown bird that lives in the arid brush of the Sinai Desert and parts of the Arabian Peninsula. Babblers live in small groups of 3 to 20 members who collectively defend a small territory of trees, shrubs, and bushes that provide much-needed cover from predators. Babblers who live as part of a group do well for themselves, whereas those who are kicked out of a group are in great danger. They're typically badgered away from other groups, have trouble finding food and shelter, and often fall prey to hawks, raptors, and snakes. 16. The social life of the babbler is rather curious. For simplicity, we'll focus on the males, but similar behaviors can be found among the females. Male babblers arrange themselves into rigid dominance hierarchies. The alpha male, for example, consistently wins in small squabbles with the beta male, who in turn consistently wins against the gamma male. Very occasionally, a much more intense fight erupts between two babblers of adjacent rank, resulting in one babbler's death or permanent ejection from the group. Most of the time, however, the males get along splendidly with each other. In fact, they frequently help one another in the group in a variety of ways. Adults donate food to each other, bring food to their communal nestlings, attack predators and members of rival groups, and stand guard duty to watch for predators while the others look for food. At first glance, these activities appear straightforwardly altruistic. A babbler who takes a stint at guard duty, for example, forgoes his own opportunity to eat. Likewise, a babbler who attacks an enemy assumes risk of serious personal injury. On more careful inspection, however, these activities turn out not to be as selfless as they seem. First of all, babblers compete to help each other in the group, often aggressively so. For example, not only do higher-ranked babblers give food to lower-ranked babblers, sometimes they force it down the throats of unwilling birds. Similarly, when a beta male is standing guard duty at the top of a tree, the alpha will often fly up and harass the beta off his perch. The beta, meanwhile, isn't strong enough to bully the alpha from guard duty, but he will often stand insistently nearby, offering to take over if the alpha male allows it. Similar jockeying takes place for the privilege of performing other altruistic behaviors. If the goal of these behaviors is to be helpful, why do the babblers waste effort competing to perform them? One hypothesis is that higher-ranked babblers are stronger and therefore better able to forego food and fight off predators. And so, by taking on more of the burden, they're actually helping their weaker groupmates. The problem with this hypothesis is that babblers compete primarily with the birds immediately above or below them in the hierarchy. The alpha male, for example, almost never tries to replace the gamma male from guard duty. Instead, the alpha directs all of his competitive energies toward the beta. If the goal were to help weaker members, the alpha should be more eager to take over from the gamma than from the beta. Even more damning is the fact that babblers often interfere in the helpful behaviors of their rivals, for example, by trying to prevent them from feeding the communal nestlings. This makes no sense if the goal is to benefit the group as a whole. So if these activities aren't altruistic, what's the point? What's in it for the individual babbler who competes to do more than his fair share of helping others? The answer, as Zahavi and his team have carefully documented, is that altruistic babblers develop a kind of credit among their groupmates, what Zahavi calls prestige status. This earns them at least two different perks, one of which is mating opportunities. Males with greater prestige get to mate more often with the females of the group. A prestigious alpha, for example, may take all the mating opportunities for himself. But if the beta has earned high prestige, the alpha will occasionally allow him to mate with some of the females. 17 In this way, the alpha effectively bribes the beta to stick around. Thus, babblers compete to help others in a way that ultimately increases their own chances of survival and reproduction. What looks like altruism is actually, at a deeper level, competitive self-interest. Human behaviors. We can't always take animal behavior at face value. That's the main lesson to draw from the preceding examples. The surface-level logic of a behavior often belies deeper, more complex motives. And this is true even in species whose lives are much simpler than our own. So we can't expect human behaviors, like voting or making art, to be straightforward either. Now, as we mentioned earlier, it would be a mistake to call these animal motives hidden, at least in the psychological sense. When baboons groom each other, they may happen not to be thinking about the political consequences, but their lack of awareness isn't strategic. They have no need to conceal the political intentions underlying their grooming behavior, and thus no need to suppress their own knowledge. Knowledge suppression is useful only when two conditions are met: when others have partial visibility into your mind, and when they're judging you and meting out rewards or punishments based on what they see in your mind. These two conditions may hold for non-human primates in some situations. In the moments leading up to a fight, for example, both animals are struggling frantically to decipher the other's intentions. 18 And thus there can be an incentive for each party to deceive the other, which may be facilitated by a bit of self-deception. Just as camouflage is useful when facing an adversary with eyes, self-deception can be useful when facing an adversary with mind-reading powers. But the mind-reading powers of non-human primates are weak compared to our own, and so they have less need to obfuscate the contents of their minds. We'll discuss this more thoroughly in later chapters, but before moving on, there's one last crucial point to make. When we study the behavior of other species, we can't help putting ourselves in their shoes in an attempt to feel what they feel and see the world through their eyes. But sometimes this method leads us astray, as when we find some animal behaviors counterintuitive, and in such cases, it says more about us than the species whose behavior we struggle to understand. For more than a century after Charles Darwin first published his theory, for example, scientists would often appeal to the good of the species in order to explain seemingly altruistic animal behaviors, like the babblers volunteering for guard duty. 19 That's certainly the kind of thing we might say if we were in the babbler's shoes, but it's not a valid naturalistic explanation either for their behavior or for our own. To find out why we often misconstrue animal motives, including our own, we have to look more carefully at how our brains were designed and what problems they're intended to solve. We have to turn, in other words, to evolution. 2. Competition. Humans are a peculiar species. We're relatively hairless, we walk on our hind legs, we dance and sing like nobody's business. We laugh, blush, and shed tears. And our babies are among the most helpless in all the animal kingdom. But perhaps our most distinctive feature is our intelligence. Relative to our body size, we have unusually large brains. Partly because of this, we're also the most behaviorally flexible creatures on the planet. But why are we so smart and flexible? And why did our brains grow so large, so quickly? Figure 2. Human ancestors' brain volume over time. Like the drunk who loses his keys and goes looking for them only under the street lamp because that's where the light is, people who study human evolution are more likely to search for explanations where the light is good. The archaeological record is biased toward objects that can endure, which means we get a pretty good picture of our ancestors' skeletons, stone tools, and some of their body paint. But we have almost no way to recover their brain tissue, vocalizations, or body language. This much is common sense. But in addition to biases in the evidence itself, we are also biased in the way we approach it. In this respect, we're not so much drunk as we are vain. We want our species to be seen in the most flattering light. There are facets of our evolutionary past that we spend less time poring over because we don't like how they make us look. In this sense, our problem isn't that the light is too dim, but that it's too harsh. Consider these two broad lights where the keys to our big brains might be found. 1. Ecological challenges, such as warding off predators, hunting big game, domesticating fire, finding new food sources, and adapting rapidly to new climates. These activities pit humans against their environment and are therefore opportunities for cooperation. 2. Social challenges, such as competition for mates, jockeying for social status, coalition politics, intergroup violence, cheating, and deception. These activities pit humans against other humans and are therefore competitive and potentially destructive. Many of us would prefer the keys to our intelligence to be found somewhere in the pleasing light of ecological challenges, implying that our extra gray matter evolved in service of cooperation. We grew smarter, the story would go, so we could learn more, collaborate better against the harsh external world, and improve outcomes for everyone, win-win-win. But many signs suggest that the keys to our intelligence lie in the harsh, unflattering light of social challenges, the arena of zero-sum games in which one person's gain is another's loss. It's not that we're completely unaware of these competitive, zero-sum instincts, we just tend to give them less prominence when explaining our behavior. It's important to understand what we're actually afraid of here. Many kinds of competition are actually easy for us to acknowledge, even celebrate. We love playful competition, for example, as in games and sports. There are no losers in wrestling, it's sometimes said, only winners and learners. We also endorse competition in service of broader cooperative activities from which we all stand to gain, like when firms compete in the marketplace, driving down costs and spurring innovation. We're even comfortable acknowledging group versus group competition, up to and including war. It's not that we necessarily enjoy competing against other groups, but it isn't awkward or uncomfortable to talk about, because competition against them highlights the shared interests among us. However destructive, war tends to bring a nation together. What's much harder to acknowledge are the competitions that threaten to drive wedges into otherwise cooperative relationships, sexual jealousy, status rivalry among friends, power struggles within a marriage, the temptation to cheat, politics in the workplace. Of course, we acknowledge office politics in the abstract, but how often do we write about it on the company blog? In general, we prefer explanations that make us look good, whether as individuals, families, communities, or nations. When it comes to our rivals, we're perfectly happy to entertain unflattering theories about their behavior, as long as the mud we fling at them doesn't spatter too much back at us. These biases and psychological sore spots don't mean it's impossible for us to think clearly about competition, only that our job becomes more difficult. All else being equal, we prefer to look for the keys to human intelligence under the light of cooperation, a light that makes us look good. But if there's reason to believe the keys are elsewhere, we need to take a deep breath, roll up our sleeves, and start looking under the harsh light of competition. Parable of the Redwoods. Kevin's native California is home to the world's tallest tree species, Sequoia sempervirens, or the coastal redwood. The tallest living specimen towers a lofty 379 feet above the forest floor. Historically, some may have been even taller, with evidence of redwoods reaching 400 feet and beyond. This is approximately the height at which capillary action ceases to work. Any taller, and a tree can't get water from its roots to its topmost leaves. So redwoods are, in a sense, as tall as arboreally possible. One height, however, doesn't come cheap, whether for a redwood or any other tree. It takes a lot of energy and material to grow upward and remain standing in the face of wind and gravity, energy and material that could otherwise be put into developing stronger roots, growing horizontally to collect more sunlight, or making and dispersing more seeds in the hope of having more offspring. So why bother? Why do trees put so much effort into vertical growth? It depends on the species. Some grow tall to disperse their seeds more effectively. Other species do it to protect their leaves from terrestrial tree eaters, like the acacia tree trying to stay out of reach from the giraffe. But for most trees, height is all about getting more sun. A forest is an intensely competitive place, and sunlight is a scarce but critical resource. And even when you're a redwood, the tallest of all tree species, you still have to worry about getting enough sun because you're in a forest of other redwoods. Often a species' most important competitor is itself. Thus the redwood is locked in an evolutionary arms race, or in this case, a height race, with itself. It grows tall because other redwoods are tall, and if it doesn't throw most of its effort into growing upward as fast as possible, it will literally wither and die in the shadows of its rivals. Suppose we came upon a solitary redwood in an open meadow, towering far, far above the other plants and animals, a lanky giant standing all alone, reaching aggressively for the sky. This would look strange, even wrong, because it's not how nature usually does things. Why would a tree waste its energy growing so high above an open field? Wouldn't it get outcompeted by a shorter variant that threw more of its energy into reproduction? Yes. And so we can reasonably infer that an open field isn't the redwood's native environment. Instead, it must have evolved in a dense forest. Its height makes perfect sense, but only given the right context. Now consider the human being. Like the redwood, our species has a distinctive feature, a huge brain. But if we think of Homo sapiens like the lone redwood in the open meadow, towering in intelligence over an otherwise brain-dead field, then we're liable to be puzzled. As shown in Figure 3, such intelligence would seem out of place, uncanny, unnecessary. Figure 3. Human versus animal intelligence. But of course, that's not the right way to think about it. We didn't evolve in the meadow, we evolved in the dense forest. And like the redwood, we weren't competing primarily against other species, but against ourselves, as shown in Figure 4. Figure 4. Humans competing in intelligence. The worst problems for people, says primatologist Dario Mestrapiri, almost always come from other people, too. The earliest Homo sapiens lived in small, tight-knit bands of 20 to 50 individuals. These bands were our groves or forests, in which we competed not for sunlight, but for resources more befitting a primate: food, sex, territory, social status. And we had to earn these things, in part, by outwitting and outshining our rivals. This is what's known in the literature as the social brain hypothesis, or sometimes the Machiavellian intelligence hypothesis. It's the idea that our ancestors got smart primarily in order to compete against each other in a variety of social and political scenarios. The way the brains of human beings have gotten bigger at an accelerating pace, writes Matt Ridley in his book on evolutionary biology, The Red Queen, implies that some such within-species arms race is at work. Steven Pinker and Paul Bloom also emphasize interspecies competition as an evolutionary cause of our intelligence. In an influential 1990 article on language evolution, they write, interacting with an organism of approximately equal mental abilities whose motives are at times outright malevolent makes formidable and ever-escalating demands on cognition. 5. Robert Travers goes even further. He argues that it was the arms race between lying and lie detection that gave rise to our intelligence. Both the detection of deception and often its propagation have been major forces favoring the evolution of intelligence. It is perhaps ironic that dishonesty has often been the file against which intellectual tools for truth have been sharpened. 6. Of course, the social brain hypothesis isn't a complete account of how and why we evolved big brains, but most scholars agree that interspecies competition was an important factor in shaping the kind of intelligence our species developed. Now if, as we've been arguing, people are biased toward emphasizing cooperation and downplaying competition, then it will serve us well to temporarily reverse this bias. In what follows, let's emphasize and accentuate the more competitive aspects of our species' history. In particular, we're going to look at 3 of the most important games played by our ancestors: sex, social status, and politics. Sex. A common tagline for natural selection is survival of the fittest, but survival actually takes a back seat to reproduction. Yes, it's important not to get eaten by tigers, but consider that every creature alive today is the final link in an unbroken chain of ancestors who managed to reproduce, and yet many of those same ancestors died in the jaws of a predator. From the perspective of evolution, mating, not survival, is the name of the game. Now, when discussing sex in our own species, it's easy to get distracted on sex differences, how men and women pursue different sexual strategies. Yes, it's true that there are biological differences between the sexes, and that they're important for understanding many aspects of human behavior. But here, we're mostly going to be glossing over such differences. To motivate our choice to lump men and women together, consider that when a species is pair-bonded and monogamous, the incentives for males and females converge. Humans aren't perfectly pair-bonded and monogamous, of course, but it's a fair approximation. In fact, as Ridley says, it is hard to overemphasize how unusual humans are in this respect. 10. Thus in sex, as in other areas of life, our approach will be to treat men and women as following the same general instincts, while perhaps giving them slightly different emphases. Also remember that we're focusing on the competitive aspects of sex. Cooperative child-rearing is essential, to be sure, but it isn't our focus of attention here. The main form of sexual competition is the competition for mates. Locally, this is largely a zero-sum competition, because within a given community, there are only a fixed number of mates to go around. Thus each of the two sexes faces competition primarily from other members of their sex. Every woman who wants to mate with a high-quality man has to compete with all the other women, while every man who wants to mate with a woman has to be chosen by her, ahead of all his rivals. As in other competitions, like the competition for sunlight among the redwoods, mate competition in a sexually reproducing species leads to an evolutionary arms race. This is illustrated most iconically by the peacock's brilliant tail, 11, which serves as an advertisement of its owner's physical and genetic fitness. Similarly, among humans, the competitive aspect of courtship implies that both men and women will be keen to advertise themselves on the mating market. We want potential mates to know that we have good genes and that we'll make good parents. The logic of this isn't particularly hard to understand, but the implications can be surprising. As Jeffrey Miller argues in The Mating Mind, our minds evolved not just as survival machines, but as courtship machines, and many of our most distinctive behaviors serve reproductive rather than survival ends. There are good reasons to believe, for example, that our capacities for visual art, music, storytelling, and humor function in large part as elaborate mating displays, not unlike the peacock's tail. Social status. Social status is traditionally defined as one's rank or position within a group where you stand on society's totem pole. It's a measure of respect and influence. The higher your status, the more other people will defer to you and the better they'll tend to treat you. As with the babblers we met in the previous chapter, social status among humans actually comes in two flavors, dominance and prestige. 12 dominance is the kind of status we get from being able to intimidate others, and on the low status side is governed by fear and other avoidance instincts. Prestige, however, is the kind of status we get from being an impressive human specimen, and it's governed by admiration and other approach instincts. Of course, these two forms of status aren't mutually exclusive. Steve Jobs, for example, exhibited both dominance and prestige. But the two forms are analytically distinct strategies with different biological expressions. They are, as some researchers have put it, the two ways to the top. 13 dominance is clearly the result of competition, which can often be vicious and destructive. It's all about strength and power, the ability to control others through force. But because only one person can come out on top in a dominance hierarchy, that person often has to knock others down in order to climb up, then continue to fight off contenders after earning the top spot. Stalin, for example, was notoriously paranoid and insecure in his hold on power, and during the Great Purge, he was responsible, directly or indirectly, for more than 600,000 deaths. 14 Prestige, meanwhile, seems much less competitive, at least on the surface. 15 It's all about respect, which can't be taken by force, but rather must be freely conferred by admirers. Nevertheless, there's only so much respect to go around. In this regard, prestige is like a popularity contest, similar to the kind found in high schools around the world. We earn prestige not just by being rich, beautiful, and good at sports, but also by being funny, artistic, smart, well-spoken, charming, and kind. These are all relative qualities, however. Compared to most other animals, every human is a certifiable genius, but that fact does little to help us in competitions within our own species. Similarly, even the poorest members of today's world are richer, by many material standards, than the kings and queens of yesteryear, and yet they remain at the bottom of the prestige ladder. Another way to think about prestige is that it's your price on the market for friendship and association. As in all markets, price is driven by supply and demand. We all have a similar supply of friendship to offer to others, but the demand for our friendship varies greatly from person to person. Highly prestigious individuals have many claims on their time and attention, many would-be friends lining up at their door. Less prestigious individuals, meanwhile, have fewer claims on their time and attention, and must therefore offer their friendship at a discount. And everyone, with an eye to raising their price, strives to make themselves more attractive as a friend or associate by learning new skills, acquiring more and better tools, and polishing their charms. Now, our competitions for prestige often produce positive side effects such as art, science, and technological innovation. 16 But the prestige seeking itself is more nearly a zero-sum game, which helps explain why we sometimes feel pangs of envy at even a close friend's success. Politics. Aristotle famously called humans the political animal, but it turns out we aren't the only species who merit that title. 17 In 1982, primatologist Franz de Waal published his influential book Chimpanzee Politics, which made a splash by ascribing political motives to non-human animals. 18 De Waal's core insight was that human power struggles are structurally analogous to those that take place among chimpanzees. With the appropriate translations, chimps' political behaviors are intelligible to us. We recognize in them the same goals and motivations that we exhibit when we politic with our fellow humans. What is it about the behavior of chimpanzees that inclines us to describe it as political? Like many other animals, chimps organize themselves into a dominance hierarchy, a more or less linear ordering from the strongest on top to the weakest on bottom, where stronger chimps make a habit of bullying the chimps below them in order to get better access to food, mates, and other opportunities. By itself, however, a dominance hierarchy is too simple and straightforward to warrant the label politics. Chickens too have a dominance hierarchy, a pecking order, but few would accuse a chicken of scheming like Machiavelli. So what turns an otherwise rigid, almost robotic dominance hierarchy into something teeming with politics? In a word, coalitions, allies who wield power together. Here's Duvall again, from his later book Our Inner Ape. 2-against-1 maneuvering is what lends chimpanzee power struggles both their richness and their danger. Coalitions are key. No male can rule by himself, at least not for long. Point 19. In other words, if you're a male chimp in a community with other males, it's not enough simply to be strong or even the strongest. You also need to gang up with a team of other strong males. You need the ability to identify, attract, and retain good allies, and you need to be savvy enough to navigate the tumult as coalitions form, dissolve, and clash all around you. Coalitions are what makes politics so political. Without the ability to form teams and work together towards shared goals, a species' political life will be stunted at the level of individual competition, every chicken for itself, pecking at every other chicken. But add just a dash of cooperation to the mix, and suddenly a species' political life begins to bloom. Scientists have documented coalition politics in a variety of species. Primates, clearly, are a political bunch, as are whales and dolphins, wolves and lions, elephants and meerkats. Point 20. But we know of no species more political than our own. Just as human brains dwarf those of other species, both in size and in complexity, so too do our coalitions. These take many forms and go by many names. In government, coalitions appear as interest groups and political parties. In business, they are teams, companies, guilds, and trade associations. In high school, coalitions are called cliques or friends. On the street and in prison, they're called gangs. Sometimes they're simply called factions. They can be as small as 2 people voting a third off the island or as large as a globe-spanning religion. They have membership criteria, the ability to recruit new members, and the ability to kick out current members. Coalition politics is something we spend a lot of time doing. Whenever we anguish over the guest list for a party, we're playing politics. Whenever we join a church because we feel welcome there, or leave a job that isn't rewarding enough, we're following our political instincts. Finding and joining teams, dealing with the attendant headaches, and leaving them when necessary are behaviors that come as readily to us as pack hunting to a wolf. Point 21. Now, if you've read a biography of Henry Kissinger or Robert Moses, or watched Survivor or Game of Thrones, you know that coalition politics can get nasty. Winning tactics often include threats, counter-threats, betrayals, deceptions, and even violence. There's a reason politics is often used as a dirty word. But it would be a huge mistake to think that politics is all arm-twisting and backstabbing. It's also full of handshaking, back-scratching, and even hugging. This was an argument made by one of Niccolò Machiavelli's lesser-known but equally astute contemporaries, Baldassare Castiglione. Both men wrote books about how to navigate the political waters of 16th-century Italian city-states. Machiavelli's famous guidebook is The Prince, written for supreme rulers, while Castiglione wrote the Book of the Courtier for those of lesser nobility who sought favor at court. But although their subject matter is similar, in many ways, the two books are polar opposites. Machiavelli emphasizes the ruthless, immoral side of human politics, whereas Castiglione emphasizes the softer, more humane ways to curry favor. The ideal courtier, in Castiglione's opinion, should be well-mannered and possessed of social graces. He should be skilled in horsemanship, poetry, music, and dance. 22. Rather than manipulating others through cunning and intimidation, the courtier should win their affections freely, through charm, flattery, and valuable companionship. Point 23. Both Machiavelli and Castiglione are right, in their own ways. The two strategies they outline are both useful for succeeding in politics. It's important to note, however, that although Castiglione's methods are less overtly competitive, they nevertheless stem from similar incentives. Not every courtier can be the king's favorite. One man's fortune is his rival's setback. So it is ultimately the same drive, wanting to win at life's various competitions, that motivates both the scheming sociopath and the charming courtier. Structural similarities. These three games, sex, politics, and social status, aren't perfectly distinct, of course. They overlap and share intermediate goals. Sometimes the prizes of one game become instruments in another. To succeed in the mating game, for example, it often pays to have high status and political clout, while an attractive mate can, in turn, raise one's social status. The three games also share some important structural similarities. As we've mentioned, they're all competitive games where not everyone can win, and where unfettered competition has the potential to get nasty. This is especially true of both sex and social status in that there are only so many mates and friends to go around. But it's also true of politics. Despite the fact that it's possible to cooperate politically in ways that enlarge the pie for everyone, this is the exception rather than the rule, especially for our distant ancestors. In most contexts, for one coalition to succeed, others must fail. Importantly, however, members within a coalition can earn themselves a larger slice of pie by cooperating, a fact that makes politics such an intoxicating game. The other important similarity is that each game requires two complementary skill sets, the ability to evaluate potential partners and the ability to attract good partners. In sex, the partners we're looking for are mates. In social status, we're looking for friends and associates. And in politics, we're looking for allies, people to team up with. When we evaluate others, we're trying to estimate their value as partners, and so we're looking for certain traits or qualities. In our mates, we want those with good genes who will make good parents. In our friends and associates, we want those who have skills, resources, and compatible personalities, and the more loyal they are to us, the better. And we're looking for similar qualities in our political allies, since they're basically friends chosen for a specific purpose. At the same time, in order to attract partners, we need to advertise our own traits, the same ones we're looking for in others. By displaying, accentuating, and even exaggerating these desirable traits, we raise our own value, helping to ensure that we'll be chosen by more and/or higher quality mates, more and/or higher status friends, and better coalitions. All of these competitions thereby result in arms races. Just as the redwoods are competing for light from the sun, we're competing for the light of attention and affection from potential mates, friends, and allies. And in each game, the way to win is to stand out over one's rivals. In this context, the advice in Matthew 7 verse 1, "Judge not, lest you be judged," is difficult to follow. It goes against the grain of every evolved instinct we have, which is to judge others readily, while at the same time advertising ourselves so that we may be judged by others. To understand the competitive side of human nature, we would do well to turn Matthew 7 verse 1 on its head, "Judge freely, and accept that you too will be judged." 24. Signals and signaling. Both of these tasks, judging and being judged, are mediated by signals. A signal, in evolutionary biology, 25, is anything used to communicate or convey information. Unblemished skin or fur, for example, is a signal of a healthy organism. Compare a prize-winning beagle to a mangy mutt. A growl is a signal of aggression, and the growl's depth is a signal of the creature's size. Signals are said to be honest when they reliably correspond to an underlying trait or fact about the sender. Otherwise, they are dishonest or deceptive. The temptation to deceive is ubiquitous. Deception allows an agent to reap benefits without incurring costs. That's why the best signals, the most honest ones, are expensive. 26 more precisely, they are differentially expensive, costly to produce, but even more costly to fake. 27 A lion's loud, deep growl, for example, is an honest signal of a large body cavity because it's impossible for a small creature, like a mouse, to make the same sound. Sometimes it's even necessary to do something risky or wasteful in order to prove that you have a desirable trait. This is known as the handicap principle. 28 It explains why species with good defense mechanisms, like skunks and poison dart frogs, evolve high-contrast colors. Unless it can defend itself, an animal that stands out quickly becomes another animal's lunch. For a non-biological example, consider the difference between blue jeans and dress pants. Jeans are durable and don't need to be washed every day, whereas dress pants demand a bit more in terms of upkeep, which is precisely why they're considered more formal attire. In the human social realm, honest signaling and the handicap principle are best reflected in the dictum, "Actions speak louder than words." 29 The problem with words is that they cost almost nothing. Talk is usually too cheap. Which is a more honest signal of your value to a company, being told "great job" or getting a raise? We rely heavily on honest signals in the competitive arenas we've been discussing. That is, whenever we try to evaluate others as potential mates, friends, and allies. Loyal friends can distinguish themselves from fair-weather friends by visiting you in the hospital, for example. Healthy mates can distinguish themselves from unhealthy ones by going to the gym or running a marathon. Initiates who get gang tattoos thereby commit themselves to the gang in a way that no verbal pledge could hope to accomplish. Of course, we also use these honest signals whenever we wish to advertise our own value as a friend, mate, or teammate. Note that we don't always need to be conscious of the signals we're sending and receiving. We may have evolved an instinct to make art, for example, as a means of advertising our artistic skills and free time, but that's not necessarily what we're thinking about as we whittle a sculpture from a piece of driftwood. We may simply be thinking about the beauty of the sculpture. Nevertheless, the deeper logic of many of our strangest and most unique behaviors may lie in their value as signals. 31 thing that makes signaling hard to analyze and practice is the phenomenon of counter-signaling. For example, consider how someone can be either an enemy, a casual friend, or a close friend. Casual friends want to distinguish themselves from enemies, and they might use signals of warmth and friendliness, things like smiles, hugs, and remembering small details about each other. Meanwhile, close friends want to distinguish themselves from casual friends, and one of the ways they can do it is by being unfriendly, at least on the surface. When a close friend forgets his wallet and can't pay for lunch, you might call him an idiot. This works only when you're so confident of your friendship that you can insult him without worrying that it will jeopardize your friendship. This isn't something a casual friend can get away with as easily, and it may even serve to bring close friends closer together. Thus, signals are often arranged into a hierarchy from non-signals to counter-signals. Outsiders to an interaction may not always be able to distinguish non-signals from counter-signals, but insiders usually know how to interpret them, if only on an intuitive level. When signals are used in competitive games, like sex, status, and politics, an arms race often results. In order to outdo the other competitors, each participant tries to send the strongest possible signal. This can result in some truly spectacular achievements: Bach's concertos, Gauguin's paintings, Shakespeare's sonnets and plays, Rockefeller's philanthropic foundation, and Einstein's theories of relativity. And sometimes, like the redwoods, humans too compete to reach for the sky, whether by climbing Mount Everest, building pyramids and skyscrapers, or launching rockets to the moon. Looking ahead, as we think about our own ancestry and how we were shaped by it, it pays to keep the redwoods in mind. Faced with intense interspecies competition, they literally rose to the occasion, out of the darkness and into the light. So too with many of our most exaggerated features. The problem with competitive struggles, however, is that they are enormously wasteful. The redwoods are so much taller than they need to be. If only they could coordinate not to all grow so tall, if they could institute a height cap at 100 feet, say, the whole species would be better off. All the energy that they currently waste racing upward, they could instead invest in other pursuits, like making more pine cones in order to spread further, perhaps into new territory. Competition, in this case, holds the entire species back. Unfortunately, the redwoods aren't capable of coordinating to enforce a height cap, and natural selection can't help them either. There's no equilibrium where all trees curtail their growth for the good of the species. If a population of redwoods were somehow restraining themselves, it would take only a few mutations for one of the trees to break ranks and grab all the sunlight for itself. This rogue tree would then soak in more energy from the sun, and thereby outcompete its rivals and leave more descendants, ensuring that the next generation of redwoods would be even more rivalrous and competitive, until eventually they were all back to being as tall as they are today. But our species is different. Unlike other natural processes, we can look ahead. And we've developed ways to avoid wasteful competition by coordinating our actions using norms and norm enforcement, a topic we turn to in the next chapter. 3. Norms. Most of us have been in a situation like this. You're standing in line to buy a movie ticket, chatting quietly with a friend and minding your own business, when a group of strangers casually angles in ahead of you. Instantly, you flush with adrenaline. Your heart starts racing and you can feel the heat surge up your neck and into your face. Did they really just cut in line? You ask yourself as you brace for the moment of truth decision. Confront them or let it slide. On the one hand, their behavior doesn't materially affect your life. It won't take more than an extra minute to get your movie ticket. Plus, you'll never see these strangers again. And what if they're the violent sort? What if one of them picks a fight? What if they have a knife or a gun? Having to spend 1 extra minute in line doesn't justify any of this risk. But on the other hand, they cheated. You can't let them walk all over you. What kind of self-respecting person lets others cut in line and get away with it? This dilemma, and the strong physiological reaction that accompanies it, is part of a behavioral toolkit that's universal among humans, something we've inherited from our forager ancestors. Our behaviors and reactions may not always make sense in a modern context, but they evolved because our ancestors confronted situations like this all the time, and what was useful for them is still useful for us. Especially when we're facing people we know rather than strangers on the street. As we saw in the previous chapter, redwood trees are trapped in unfettered competition with each other. Under natural selection, there's no way for them to curtail their growth for the good of the species. But humans are different. Unlike the rest of nature, we can sometimes see ahead and coordinate to avoid unnecessary competition. This is one of our species' superpowers, that we're occasionally able to turn wasteful competition into productive cooperation. Instead of always bull rushing to the front of a line, for example, we can wait patiently and orderly. But as the occasional line cutter reminds us, there's always a temptation to cheat, and maintaining order isn't always easy. For sociologists and anthropologists, conventions like queuing are known as norms. They're the rules or standards about how members of a community should behave. They range from loose and formal guidelines, like what to wear to a cocktail party, all the way to explicit, strictly enforced laws, like needing a license to drive on public roads. Table manners, sportsmanship, maritime law, the U.S. tax code, Robert's Rules of Order, and the use of inside voices at a library, these are but a few examples of the variety of norms that have proliferated in human cultures. And as we'll see in coming chapters, the desire to skirt and subvert norms is one of the key reasons we deceive ourselves about our own intentions. Human groups develop norms because they benefit the majority of people in the group. Now, some norms, especially top-down laws, can be oppressive or extractive and an overall detriment to the societies that enforce them. But most norms, especially of the bottom-up, grassroots variety, are beneficial. They're one of the main ways we suppress competition and promote cooperation. In other words, we hold ourselves back, collectively, for our own good. In Debt, the anthropologist David Graeber tells the story of T. Rena, a Maori villager and notorious glutton who used to wander up and down the New Zealand coast, badgering the local fishermen by asking for the best portions of their catch. Since it's impolite in Maori culture to refuse a direct request for food, the fishermen would oblige, but with ever-increasing reluctance. And so as Rena continued to ask for food, their resentment grew until one day, people decided enough was enough and killed him. This story is extreme, to say the least, but it illustrates how norm following and norm enforcement can be a very high-stakes game. Rena flouted an important norm and eventually paid dearly for it. But just as tellingly, the fishermen who put him to death felt so duty-bound by a different norm that they followed it even to the point of building up murderous resentment. Couldn't you just have said no to Rienga's requests? We want to shout at the villagers. But similarly, we should ask ourselves, can't we just let it go when someone cuts in line? These instincts run deep. Most norms, of course, aren't enforced on pain of death. In general, the punishment will be tailored to the crime. When you forget to zip up your fly, for example, no one's going to arrest you for public indecency, they're just going to snicker. For minor transgressions, then, we have an arsenal of soft sanctions we try to use before escalating to more serious forms of punishment. Instead of lashing out physically at a transgressor, we might roll our eyes or flash a disapproving scowl. If body language doesn't work, we might ask the transgressor to stop or yell and demand an apology, perhaps in front of others. But the threat of some kind of punishment must always be present, or a norm is little more than hot air. Covenants, says Thomas Hobbes, without the sword, are but words. Similarly, you can't have enforcement without creating a de facto norm, regardless of whether you're willing to admit that it's a norm or not. And cults of personality, for example, such as those that formed around Mao Zedong or Steve Jobs, criticizing the leader is often frowned upon, and punished even by people other than the leaders themselves, even if criticizing the leader isn't officially forbidden. The essence of a norm, then, lies not in the words we use to describe it, but in which behaviors get punished and what form the punishment takes. Our forager ancestors. Humans were the first animals on Earth to develop true norms. And even though we currently live in a world with a great variety of norms, including strict laws enforced by a complex legal system, our world grew out of an earlier, simpler world and still bears many features from that earlier period. For this reason, it's helpful to get acquainted with our species' upbringing. Foraging, also known as hunting and gathering, is the lifestyle our ancestors practiced until the agricultural revolution starting around 10,000 BC. Now, the portrait we're about to paint of the foraging lifestyle is actually a portrait of modern foragers, peoples who have maintained this way of life into the 20th and 21st centuries. Such groups are rare, perhaps as few as 20 are known to anthropologists. And no doubt they have been influenced by modernity in various ways, whether through contact with settled civilizations or simply by being relegated to environments that are unprofitable for farming, trading, and other civilized purposes. Even so, the data about this way of life is consistent enough and corroborated by enough archaeological evidence and reasoning for us to develop at least a rough sketch of how our ancestors probably lived. 3 foragers live a nomadic life in bands of 20 to 50 individuals. Foraging, here, refers to their way of getting food, that is, extracting it from the natural environment, rather than by farming or herding. Most of their calories come from gathering fruit, nuts, and vegetables, but many groups supplement these gatherings with calories from fishing, hunting, and occasionally scavenging. Despite its prominence in the public imagination, big game hunting is rarely the main source of calories. Foragers are intensely reliant on each other for survival. To be without a band for more than a short time is effectively a death sentence. Everyone is expected to try to provide for themselves and to pitch in and help each other as they're able, but they can reasonably expect help from the rest of the band if they fall on hard times. At minimum, cooperative social life includes sharing food among the group, helping and learning from each other, hunting and scavenging in groups, coordinating to defend the band from predators and rival groups, and caring for each other when sick. Men, women, and children divide labor variously among themselves, but there's only a limited division of labor within each class. Favors are traded freely, but unlike in large modern economies, there are few gains to be made by trading material goods. Each band moves throughout a large territory, setting up camp in a particular location for a few weeks or a few months, and moving camp at least several times a year, when food becomes scarce or to take advantage of seasonal opportunities. Owing to their nomadism, foragers don't have much in the way of property. They own only as much as they can carry. They typically have loose associations with a small handful of neighboring bands, primarily for socializing. Bands usually don't see themselves as owning territory. Rivalries between groups do sometimes occur, sometimes even leading to deaths, but all-out war is quite rare and tends to occur only in dense regions rich in resources. When to move camp and how to relate to other bands are all group-level decisions, discussed in open meetings where everyone has a say. Decisions are made by consensus, and dissenters are free to leave the band. Foragers tend to be patrilocal, meaning that men stay in their native band, typically for their entire lives, while women move to another when they come of age. Men and women don't typically mate for life, although they do practice years-long serial monogamy peppered with the occasional infidelity. A typical sexual relationship will produce at least one and perhaps a few children, and the father will help feed and raise his children for at least the first few years. Despite occasional periods of hardship, foragers enjoy plenty of leisure time, more so than farmers, in fact, which they spend talking, joking, playing, singing, dancing, making art, and otherwise socializing among themselves. The most striking feature of the nomadic foraging lifestyle, distinguishing it both from the chimpanzee lifestyle and our modern way of life, is its fierce egalitarianism. The main political actors within a band, which always includes adult men and sometimes adult women as well, depending on the culture, relate to each other as peers and equals. Relative to foragers, both chimps and farmers are much more hierarchical and tolerant of direct authority and high degrees of overt inequality. Hierarchy, however, is alien to the forager way of life. Insofar as there are leaders within a forager band, they are people who are voluntarily respected by the rest of the band. Think council of elders rather than an alpha strongman. Egalitarianism among foragers is concerned primarily with preventing a single individual or coalition from dominating the rest of the group. This leads foragers to be vigilant for early warning signs of people who position themselves above others. This includes dominating or bullying individuals, bragging, seeking authority too eagerly, ganging up with other members of the group, and otherwise attempting to control others' behavior. Foragers would readily support the motto of the early American General Christopher Gadsden, "Don't tread on me." Many of the norms that were common among our forager ancestors are by now deeply embedded in human nature. But these aren't our only norms. Most societies also teach their children norms specific to their society. This ability of societies to adopt differing norms is part of what has let humans spread across the earth by adopting norms better suited to each local environment. This cultural flexibility also enabled our ancestors to implement the huge behavior changes required to turn hunters and gatherers into farmers and herders roughly 10,000 years ago. Farmers have norms supporting marriage, war, and property, as well as rough treatment of animals, lower classes, and slaves. To help enforce these new norms, farmers also had stronger norms of social conformity, as well as stronger religions with moralizing gods. Why norms? The insistent egalitarianism of our ancestors was arguably the world's first true norm. But how was it that our ancestors, and no other primate species, developed this characteristic political style? Language is clearly a big factor. It's hard, although certainly not impossible, to imagine a community developing and enforcing norms without having language to express them. But before and beneath the communication challenge lies a more fundamental challenge: how to ensure that everyone, even the most powerful members of the community, abide by its norms. It's important to distinguish what humans are doing and following norms from what other animals are doing in their related patterns of behavior. An animal that decides not to pick a fight is, in most cases, simply worried about the risk of getting injured, not about some abstract norm against violence. Likewise, an animal that shares food with non-kin is typically just angling for future reciprocity, not following some norm of food sharing. The incentives surrounding true norms are more complex. When we do something wrong, we have to worry about reprisal not just from the wrong party, but also from third parties. Frequently, this means the entire rest of our local group, or at least a majority of it. Big Strong Albert could easily steal from Wimpy Bob without fearing trouble from Bob himself, but in human groups, Albert would then face sanctions from the rest of the community. Collective enforcement, then, is the essence of norms. This is what enables the egalitarian political order so characteristic of the forager lifestyle. If you refrain from hitting people because you're afraid they'll hit you back, that's not a norm. If you're afraid of speaking out against a dangerous regime because you're worried about retaliation from the regime itself, that's not a norm. But if you're worried that your neighbors might disapprove and even coordinate to punish you, then you're most likely dealing with a norm. It's this third-party, collective enforcement that's unique to humans. Paul Bingham calls this coalition enforcement, highlighting the fact that norm violators are punished by a coalition, that is, people acting in concert. 6. Christopher Bohm calls it a reverse dominance hierarchy, where instead of the strongest apes dominating the group, and humans it's the rest of the group, working together, that's able to dominate the strongest apes and keep them effectively in check. What both thinkers identify as a key to enabling this kind of behavior, in our species and ours alone, is the use of deadly weapons. Box 3. Weapons. Weapons are a game changer for two reasons. First, they level the playing field between weak and strong members of a group. The earliest weapons were probably little more than sharp or heavy rocks, but still they would have sufficed to kill or seriously injure their targets. Without such weapons, the strong can physically dominate the weak without having to worry too much about retaliation. Even if a weaker chimp surprises a stronger chimp by attacking it while it's asleep, the weaker chimp is unlikely to get enough advantage to tip the odds in its favor. With weapons, however, landing the first blow can yield a decisive advantage. A weaker human can maim or kill a stronger one with just a single large rock to the head or sharp rock to the neck. Another way weapons alter the balance of power applies to projectile weapons like stones or spears. Such distance weapons make it much easier for a coalition to gang up on a single individual. Without distance weapons, all violence must take place at close range in hand-to-hand combat. This ensures that there is little value in ganging up on a single individual with more than about 3 attackers. A fourth attacker would only get in the way. And a 3-against-1 melee still carries a big risk of serious injury for the attackers, especially if the one they're attacking is the strongest of the group. But with distance weapons, a coalition of 5 or 7 can gang up on a despotic alpha individual with much lower risk to themselves, simply by surrounding the alpha while carrying heavy rocks or spears. Once weapons enter the picture, physical strength is no longer the most crucial factor in determining a hominid's success within a group. It's still important, mind you, but not singularly important. In particular, political skill, being able to identify, join, and possibly lead the most effective coalition, takes over as the determining factor. So, if Baum, Bingham, and the others are right, it was learning to use deadly weapons that was the inflection point in the trajectory of our species' political behavior. Once our ancestors learned how to kill and punish each other collectively, nothing would be the same. Coalition size would balloon almost overnight. Politics would then become exponentially more complicated and require more intelligence to navigate, and brains would struggle to catch up for thousands of generations. And soon, norms would begin to proliferate, starting with the norm against being a too-dominant alpha, and continuing to this day as we invent new norms for every new context we develop. Theories about what happened among our distant ancestors are necessarily somewhat speculative. But whatever happened, where we ended up as a species is clear. We are social animals who use language to decide on rules that the whole group must follow, and we use the threat of collective punishment to enforce these rules against even the strongest individuals. And although many rules vary from group to group, there are some, like those prohibiting rape and murder, that are universal to all human cultures. Even with our weapons and the ability to punish people collectively, however, norms can be very difficult to enforce. This important fact is often masked by our modern institutions, police, courts, prisons, and so forth, which work pretty smoothly, but only as the result of millennia of cultural evolution. For our distant ancestors, though, and for modern people in environments without strong oversight and governance, norm enforcement is a tricky business. This includes most of our social life, which is governed less by the threat of lawsuits and jail and more by the awkward norm enforcement behaviors of our peers. It's more like keeping people from cutting in line than calling the police to deal with robbery. That's why humans have at least two other tricks up our sleeves to incentivize good norm-following behavior: gossip and reputation. Gossip and reputation. Among lay people, gossip gets a pretty bad rap, but anthropologists see it differently. Gossip, talking about people behind their backs, often focusing on their flaws or misdeeds, is a feature of every society ever studied. 11. And while it can often be mean-spirited and hurtful, gossip is also an important process for curtailing bad behavior, especially among powerful people. If and when the North Korean regime is eventually toppled, for example, it will be in large part because citizens whispered in private about the failings of the supreme leader. Kevin experienced this benefit of gossip at a previous job when he and his teammates accidentally hired a bully. They didn't immediately realize their mistake, as often happens in these situations, because the bully's bad behavior developed gradually and only in proportion to how much influence he had gained at the company. But by the time it was clear that he was a bad apple, no one was willing to stand up to him. He had become too powerful, and it wasn't in anyone's individual self-interest to risk accusing him. The solution was gossip. Through lots of 2- and 3-person discussions behind closed doors, Kevin and his teammates eventually settled on the consensus opinion that the bully had to go, and that they would all coordinate to make it happen. These conversations eventually led to his termination, but it took a lot longer than expected, and the outcome was far from certain. If the bully had been slightly more powerful or slightly less troublesome, it might have turned out differently. This kind of drama plays out in every kind of human community, from work teams and church groups to social clubs and political parties. In many of these cases, gossip is the way we coordinate on throwing someone out. But gossip is important and useful even when it doesn't lead to formal sanctions, because it can substantially damage the reputation of whomever is being gossiped about. It's the threat of such reputational damage that provides an important check on bad behavior, especially in cases when direct punishment is too difficult or costly to enforce. Of course, the ability of gossip to damage someone's reputation is also why gossip is so often used maliciously. But when it comes to norm enforcement, it's important to see this as an abuse, a perversion, of an otherwise important sanctioning mechanism. Reputation is also important for incentivizing people to help enforce norms. Standing up to norm violators can be risky, especially when they're powerful. It's rarely in people's best interests to stick out their necks to punish transgressors. But throw some reputation into the mix and it can suddenly become profitable. Someone who helps evict a cheater will be celebrated for her leadership. Who would you rather team up with? Someone who stands by while rules are flouted, or someone who stands up for what's right? When everyone is watching and judging everyone else, both for their individual behaviors and their efforts to punish cheaters, norms and their enforcement become viable enterprises. Box 4. The Meta-Norm. Kevin's story illustrates that it's difficult to enforce norms because anyone who tries to mete out punishment faces the risk of retaliation. It doesn't seem worth it, and yet, somehow, humans manage to enforce a variety of norms. How can we resolve this puzzle? One of the first scientists to study this formally was Robert Axelrod, a political scientist and game theorist who constructed a simple but illustrative model of norm-related behavior. 12. What Axelrod found is that, in most situations, people have no incentive to punish cheaters. However, and this was Axelrod's great contribution, the model can be made to work in favor of the good guys with one simple addition, a norm of punishing anyone who doesn't punish others. Axelrod called this the metanorm. The metanorm highlights how groups need to create an incentive for good citizens to punish cheaters. Whether that incentive comes by way of the stick or the carrot doesn't really matter. Axelrod framed it in terms of the stick, and that not standing up to a cheater is itself a punishable act. But a group may fare just as well by positively rewarding people who help to punish cheaters. Many other scientists have replicated Axelrod's results in the lab, with human subjects playing various games that allow players to cheat and punish each other. And there's good evidence that many real communities employ a version of the metanorm. In the United States, for example, it's unlawful to witness a crime without reporting it. Subtle but important norms. As we've mentioned, humans have developed a wide variety of norms to constrain individual behavior. Many of these, like the norms against murder, rape, assault, and theft, are so obvious and so strongly enforced that they simply aren't relevant for this book. The norms we care about here are the subtle ones, violations of which are so hard to detect that we often don't notice even when we do it ourselves. Typically, these are crimes of intent. If you just happen to be friendly with someone else's spouse, no big deal. But if you're friendly with romantic or sexual intentions, that's inappropriate. By targeting intentions rather than actions, norms can more precisely regulate the behavior patterns that cause problems within communities. But regulating intentions also opens the door to various kinds of cheating, which we'll explore in Chapter 4. Part of our thesis is that these weaker norms, the ones that regulate our intentions, are harder to notice, especially when we violate them ourselves, because we've developed that blind spot, the elephant in the brain. For this reason, it pays to dwell on a few of them, to remind ourselves that there's a lot of social pressure to conform to these norms, but that we would benefit from violating these norms freely, if only we could get away with it. Bragging. Clearly, we all enjoy tooting our own horns now and again, and so bragging is tolerated occasionally and in small doses. And in some contexts, bragging may even be celebrated. Consider Muhammad Ali, for instance. But in most contexts, we start to bristle when people get too full of themselves. It's part of that forager aversion to dominance, since bragging is a way to increase one's influence and dominance within a community. We'd be wary of Daniel Kahneman, for example, if he went around introducing himself as a Nobel Prize winner. We'd wonder why he felt the need to put himself above everyone else. For this reason, we actively celebrate people for being humble and enjoy seeing arrogant people brought down a peg or two. But note that there remains a strong incentive to brag and show off. We need people to notice our good qualities, skills, and achievements. How else will they know to choose us as friends, mates, and teammates? We want people to notice our charitable contributions, our political connectedness, and our prowess in art, sport, and school. If it weren't for Bowden, we'd post to Facebook every time we donated to charity, got a raise at work, or made friends with an important person. But because bragging is frowned upon, we have to be a little more discreet, a topic we'll explore in the next chapter. Currying favor. When a high-status person chooses someone as a mate, friend, or teammate, it's often seen as an endorsement of this associate, raising that person's status. This creates an incentive to win the affections of people with high status. But there are acceptable and unacceptable ways to do this. It's perfectly acceptable just to be yourself, for example. If you're naturally impressive or likable, then it seems right and proper for others to like and respect you as well. What's not acceptable is sycophancy, brown-nosing, bootlicking, groveling, toadying, and sucking up. Nor is it acceptable to buy high-status associates via cash, flattery, or sexual favors. These tactics are frowned on or otherwise considered illegitimate, in part because they ruin the association signal for everyone else. We prefer celebrities to endorse products because they actually like those products, not because they just want cash. We think bosses should promote workers who do a good job, not workers who just sleep with the boss. Nevertheless, these temptations exist. Subgroup politics. Like the norms against bragging and currying favor, the norm against subgroup politics is routinely violated. There are large areas of modern life where people are actively, aggressively political, such as in Washington, D.C. But the taboo against politics is typically strong in small group settings. In most workplaces, for example, it's considered bad form, even a danger to the group, for someone to be openly political. Warring factions can tear a group apart, or at least keep it from achieving its full potential. Of course, as with bragging, there are gains to be had by individuals from acting politically. That's why the norm exists. But it also means we should expect to find the norm routinely violated, especially covertly. Selfish motives. Perhaps the most comprehensive norm of all, a catch-all that includes bragging, currying favor, and political behavior, but extends to everything else that we're supposed to do for pro-social reasons, is the norm against selfish motives. It's also the linchpin of our thesis. Consider how awkward it is to answer certain questions by appealing to selfish motives. Why did you break up with your girlfriend? I'm hoping to find someone better. Why do you want to be a doctor? It's a prestigious job with great pay. Why do you draw cartoons for the school paper? I want people to like me. There's truth in all these answers, but we systematically avoid giving them, preferring instead to accentuate our higher, purer motives. Getting our bearings. In Chapter 2, we discussed how humans, like all animals, are competitive and selfish, and argued that competition was an important driving force in the evolution of our big brains. Then, in this chapter, we discussed how humans, unlike other animals, learn to limit wasteful interspecies competition by the use of norms. Careful readers will have noticed the tension between these two facts. Specifically, if norms succeed at restricting competition, it reduces the incentive to be a clever competitor. For example, suppose our ancestors were successful in enforcing their no politics norm, nipping every political act right in the bud. In such a climate, there's little value in lugging around a big, politically savvy brain. In fact, big brains are extremely expensive. Ours, for example, eats up 1/5 of our resting energy. So successful norm enforcement should have caused human brains to shrink. But of course our brains didn't shrink, they ballooned. And this wasn't in spite of our norms, but because of them. To find out why, we turn to the topic of cheating. 4. Cheating. Everybody cheats. Let's just get that out up front. There's no use denying it. Yes, some people cheat less than others, and we ought to admire them for it. But no one makes it through life without cutting a few corners. There are simply too many rules and norms, and to follow them all would be inhuman. Most of us honor the big, important rules, like those prohibiting robbery, arson, rape, and murder. But we routinely violate small and middling norms. We lie, jaywalk, take office supplies from work, fudge numbers on our tax returns, make illegal U-turns, suck up to our bosses, have extramarital affairs, and use recreational drugs. Your two co-authors, for example, will both confess to having committed more than half of these minor crimes. Point 1. Why do we cheat? It's simple. Cheating lets us reap benefits without incurring the typical costs. Nearly 100% of elite competitive swimmers pee in the pool, says Carly Gear, a member of the U.S. national swim team. Some deny it, some proudly embrace it, but everyone does. Why? Because it's too inconvenient to take bathroom breaks in the middle of practice. Our ancestors did a lot of cheating. How do we know? One source of evidence is the fact that our brains have special purpose adaptations for detecting cheaters. When abstract logic puzzles are framed as cheating scenarios, for example, we're a lot better at solving them. This is one of the more robust findings in evolutionary psychology, popularized by the wife and husband team Leda Cosmides and John Tooby. 4. But of course, if our ancestors needed to evolve brains that were good at cheater detection, it's because their peers were routinely trying to cheat them, and those peers were also our ancestors. Thus early humans were locked in an evolutionary arms race, pitting the skills of some at cheating against the skills of others at detecting cheating. Human brains also have adaptations that help us cheat and evade norms. The most basic way to get away with something, whether you're stealing, cheating on your spouse, or just picking your nose, is simply to avoid being seen. One of our norm evasion adaptations, then, is to be highly attuned to the gaze of others, especially when it's directed at us. Eyes that are looking straight at us jump out from a crowd. Across dozens of experiments, participants who were being watched, even just by cartoon eyes, were less likely to cheat. People also cheat less in full light, or when the concept of God, the all-seeing watcher, is activated in their minds. 8. Perhaps more important is the emotion of shame and the behaviors that attend to it. Shame is the anguish we feel at being seen by others in degrading circumstances. When we feel shame, like when we're the subject of scandal, we cover our faces, hang our heads, or avoid social contact altogether. And it's our fear of shame that prompts us either to refrain from cheating or else to cover our tracks so others don't find out. But we need to be careful here. If we focus too much on how cheaters avoid detection, it will distract us from a much more interesting type of cheating, doing it out in the open. Consider these two very different norm evasion scenarios. 1. Cheating on a test. When taking the test, you slip out to the bathroom to look up answers on your phone. 2. Drinking in public. In most parts of the United States, drinking alcohol in public is illegal. But there's a time-honored solution, which is to wrap your bottle in a brown paper bag. In the first case, cheating on a test, your goal is simple: don't let the professor find out. The professor has a strong interest in keeping things fair, so in order to get away with cheating, you need to be as discreet and furtive as possible. The incentives that govern drinking in public, however, are considerably more subtle. Crucially, it doesn't really fool anyone when you hide your booze in a paper bag, least of all the police. If the police want to cite you for public drinking, they can just waltz over, catch the smell of alcohol on your breath, and arrest you or issue a citation. But they usually won't bother. Why not? That's the puzzle we're going to study in this chapter, how we can often get away with cheating using only a modest amount of discretion. Again, this isn't true of all forms of cheating. People don't look the other way when they find a dead body. But there are many cases where the thinnest of pretexts, the most modest of fig leaves, can tip the scales of justice. A quick caveat. As we discuss cheating in the rest of this chapter, it's important not to get distracted by the urge to moralize about how wrong it is. There's a time and place for discussing how we should behave. In fact, we're so keen to moralize that we take almost every time and place as an opportunity to do so. But we need this book to be a judgment-free zone where we can admit to our bad tendencies and motives without worrying that we're falling short of our ideals. We need here to see ourselves as we are, not as we'd like to be. Note also that, depending on your moral compass, some of these norm violations won't be considered wrong. Recreational drug use is an oft-cited example. But regardless of whether it's wrong to do drugs, much of society still treats it as a form of cheating. Drug users still have to take evasive maneuvers. So again, we'll be taking an amoral stance. We need to stay focused on how people break and skirt the rules, not whether their behavior is good or bad or whether the rules are just or unjust. Common knowledge. In Hans Christian Andersen's famous fairy tale The Emperor's New Clothes, an emperor is swindled when two con men come to town offering to weave him an expensive new outfit. In fact, the outfit they weave is nothing more than thin air. But they tell the emperor that the clothes are invisible only to people who are stupid and incompetent. Anxious about his own intelligence, the emperor plays along, and so do all his subjects. What fine, beautiful clothes, they all say. Finally, during a procession through town, a small child blurts out the truth: the emperor is naked. And suddenly the spell is broken. Everyone decides that if an innocent child can't see the clothes, then there is nothing to see. They've all been duped. The key to understanding this fairy tale, and much of what we're going to discuss in this book, is the concept of common knowledge. 10. For a piece of information to be common knowledge within a group of people, it's not enough simply for everyone to know it. Everyone must also know that everyone else knows it, and know that they know that they know it, and so on. It could as easily be called open or conspicuous knowledge. In his book Rational Ritual, the political scientist Michael Chu illustrates common knowledge using email. 11. If you invite your friends to a party using the 2NCC fields, the party will be common knowledge, because every recipient can see every other recipient. But if you invite your guests using the BCC field, even though each recipient individually will know about the party, it won't be common knowledge. We might refer to information distributed this way, in the BCC style, as closeted rather than common. Whether information is common or closeted can make a world of difference. In The Emperor's New Clothes, the whole town knew that the king was being swindled by the con men, but this fact was crucially not common knowledge. Everyone saw the king was naked, but at the same time, everyone was worried that other people might believe the con men, so no adult was willing to speak up and risk looking like a fool. And yet, once the innocent child said what everyone was thinking, it broke the conspiracy of silence. And then, like water from a bursting dam, knowledge flooded out from the closets and into the commons. Common knowledge is the difference between privately telling an individual and making a big public announcement, between a lesbian who's still in the closet and one who's fully open about her sexuality. between an awkward moment that everyone tries to pretend didn't happen and one that everyone acknowledges. Common knowledge is information that's fully on the record, available for everyone to see and discuss openly. Here's another way to think about it. We typically treat discretion or secret keeping as an activity that has only one important dimension: how widely a piece of information is known. But actually there are two dimensions to keeping a secret: how widely it's known and how openly, 12, or commonly it's known. And a secret can be widely known without being openly known. The closeted lesbian's sexuality, for example, or the fact that the emperor is naked. Cheating is largely an exercise in discretion. In order to get away with something, you need to keep others from finding out about it. Sometimes only one dimension of secrecy is relevant. When you cheat on a test, for example, all that matters is whether one particular person, the professor, finds out. Conversely, when you drink alcohol on the street, it matters very little which particular people, or even how many of them, realize what you're doing. What matters more is how openly it's known. And this is where a thin brown bag can make all the difference. If you brazenly flaunt an open beer bottle, the police are likely to give you trouble. This is because when you drink openly, it's clear not only to the police that you're breaking the law, but also to every passing citizen, including the most prudish members of the morality brigade. A police officer who turns a blind eye to conspicuous public drinking is open to a lot more criticism from everyone involved than an officer who ignores discreet public drinking. In this case, the brown paper bag doesn't fool the police officers themselves, but it provides them with just enough cover to avoid taking flack from their constituents. When a little discretion goes a long way. Tickets. I need tickets. Anyone selling their tickets? Scalping, the unauthorized reselling of tickets, typically at the entrance to concerts and sporting events, is illegal in roughly half of the states in the United States. 13. That's why you'll often hear scalpers hawking their goods with the counterintuitive request to buy tickets. Like wrapping alcohol in a paper bag, this practice doesn't fool the people who are charged with stopping it. The police and venue security personnel know exactly what's going on, and yet scalpers find it overwhelmingly in their interests to keep up the charade. This is another illustration of how even modest acts of discretion can thwart attempts at enforcing norms and laws. Note that professional norm enforcers, such as police, teachers, and human resource managers, have a strong incentive to enforce norms. It's their job. Even so, they're often overworked or subject to lax oversight, and therefore tempted to cut corners. Sometimes the threat of mere paperwork can be enough to keep police from enforcing minor infractions. 14. Meanwhile, the rest of us, non-professionals, have even weaker incentives to enforce norms. We may have to stand up against our peers, or even our superiors, and we have to do it without any formal authority, so our cost-benefit calculation is already teetering on the edge of profitability, perched between red and black. All it takes is a gentle nudge to send it definitively into the red. It's also important to remember that norm enforcement typically involves more than simply detecting that a norm violation has occurred. It also requires successfully prosecuting the violation, which means getting other members of the community to agree that a crime has taken place. Federal investigators might be arbitrarily certain that Tony Soprano is a mafioso, for example, without having enough evidence to convict him in a court of law. Similarly, when your boss steals credit for your ideas at work, you can be certain of it, but good luck convincing your boss's boss. In general, it's much easier for first-hand witnesses to detect a crime than to convince others who are far removed. The takeaway for the would-be cheater is that anything that hampers enforcement will improve the odds of getting away with a crime. This is where discretion comes in. Such discretion can take many forms. Pretexts. These function as ready-made excuses or alibis. Discreet communication. Keeping things on the down low. Skirting a norm instead of violating it outright. Subtlety. In honor cultures, an open insult is considered ample provocation for violence. In contrast, an insult that's subtle enough not to land on the record will often get a pass. All of these techniques work by the same mechanism in that they prevent a norm violation from becoming full common knowledge, which makes it more difficult to prosecute. Let's look at a few of these techniques in greater detail. Pretexts, ready-made excuses. In 1527, King Henry VIII's marriage to Queen Catherine of Aragon seemed unlikely to give him the son he desperately needed, and at 38 years old, he was running out of options. Everyone at court knew that Henry wanted a younger woman, and Boleyn, as his wife. Unfortunately, his marriage to Catherine had been blessed by the previous pope, and the current pope was in no mood to grant an annulment. What the king needed was a pretext, a false but plausible justification to distract from his real reason. So, nearly 20 years into his marriage to Catherine, the king suddenly discovered that she hadn't been a virgin on their wedding night, and that therefore their marriage was illegitimate. As pretexts go, this was pretty ham-handed. But kings don't need their excuses to be particularly subtle or airtight. Their power is enough of an incentive for most people to go along. In Henry's case, his pretext was enough to let him break from Roman Catholicism and secure his annulment from the head of the new Anglican Church. 15 pretexts are a broad and useful tool for getting away with norm violations. They make prosecution more difficult by having a ready explanation for your innocence. This makes it harder for others to accuse and prosecute you. And as we've seen, a pretext doesn't need to fool everyone, it simply needs to be plausible enough to make people worry that other people might believe it. Pretexts abound in human social life. Smoke shops sell drug paraphernalia, pipes, bongs, vaporizers as devices for smoking tobacco. Executives voluntarily step down to spend more time with family. When a hotel invites its guests to consider the environment before leaving their used towels out to be washed, its primary concern isn't the environment but its bottom line. But to impose on guests merely to save money violates norms of hospitality, hence the pretext. Point 16. Discreet communication. Conspire, v. Make secret plans jointly to commit an unlawful or harmful act. The word conspire has a fun etymology. It comes from the Latin com dash, meaning together, plus spirare, meaning to breathe. Picture two nobles conspiring to assassinate the king. They're hunched together in one of the castle hallways whispering, breathing together, to coordinate their activities. They keep their voices low, speak cryptically about the plan, and keep their meeting as brief as possible before parting ways. In communicating discreetly with each other, what are the nobles hoping to achieve? First, they're hoping not to be noticed at all. If they are noticed whispering together, they hope their voices aren't overheard. If their voices are overheard, they hope their words can't be made out. If their words can be made out, they hope the meaning is unclear. And finally, even if their meaning is clear to individual eavesdroppers, they hope their plans can remain closeted knowledge rather than becoming common knowledge. Imagine two guards patrolling the castle together who happen to have overheard the nobles. Both guards might individually suspect a plot, but they might also be secretly happy about it. Neither could openly admit to endorsing treason, but because the nobles were whispering, each guard can pretend not to have heard. If, instead, the nobles had been speaking loudly and openly, the plot would become common knowledge between the guards, and they would feel compelled to arrest the conspirators. As a rule of thumb, whenever communication is discreet, subtle, cryptic, or ambiguous, it's a fair bet that the speaker is trying to get away with something by preventing the message from becoming common knowledge. Examples include body language. A nod, a glance, a knowing smile, a quick roll of the eyes, or a friendly touch on the arm. In general, body language is discreet in a way that words aren't, because they are harder to interpret and quote to third parties. The meaning of a wink, says Michael Chu in Rational Ritual, depends on it not being common knowledge. 17 will take a closer look at body language in Chapter 7. Cryptic communication. Using words or phrases whose meaning is obscure, but which are more easily understood by one's target audience than by hostile eavesdroppers. This is one reason we develop and use so much slang for bad, questionable, or illegal behavior. Terms like hooking up, 420, and gaming all proliferate partly in order to stay half a step ahead of the authorities. 18 Subtlety and subtext. Indirection, hints, and innuendo. Such tactics allow us to convey meaning while retaining enough semantic elbow room to deny the message later, if need be. Examples include veiled threats and broaching bad behaviors such as prostitution or drugs. Symbolism. In her novel Ethan Frome, Edith Wharton cleverly symbolizes the sexual relationships between her main characters using two uncanny dinner items, pickles and donuts. More seriously, symbols can be used to rally resistance against a corrupt regime. If a resistance movement becomes associated with a particular color, people can wear that color to support the resistance without making themselves as vulnerable to attack by the ruling regime. Informal speech. In general, the more formal your speech, the more the message is quotable and on the record. And vice versa, less formal speech is typically off the record. These techniques can be useful even when there are only two people involved. Consider a man propositioning a woman for sex after a couple dates. 19 If he asks openly, "Would you like to have sex tonight?" it puts both of their faces on the line. Everything becomes less deniable. The solution is a little euphemism. Want to come up and see my etchings? Both parties have a pretty clear idea of what's being suggested, but crucially their knowledge doesn't rise to the status of common knowledge. He doesn't know that she knows that he was offering sex, at least not with certainty. Still, a question lingers. If both parties understand the proposition, why does it matter whether it's common knowledge? One way to model scenarios like this is to imagine a cast of peers waiting in the wings, eager to hear what happened on the date. This is the audience, real or imagined, in front of whom the couple is performing an act of cryptic communication, hoping to exchange a message, an offer of sex along with an answer, without its becoming common knowledge. Neither party needs to be consciously aware that they're performing in front of this imagined cast. This is simply how people, with years of practice, learn to act in order to save face. An imagined audience, whether eavesdropping or learning about the scenario secondhand, is also a good way to model other norm violation scenarios. When a crime boss says to one of his henchmen, "Take care of our friend over there," he's performing in front of a law enforcement system that might question him or his henchmen at some later date. Of course, in talking this way, the boss accepts a small risk that he'll be misunderstood. Some of his kill orders won't be carried out, while other innocuous orders may be accidentally interpreted as orders to kill. This is the cost of doing business in the shadows. Skirting norms. Real-life norms have many gray areas and iffy boundary cases. This is because it's impossible to create standards everyone can agree on. Wittgenstein famously argued that it's impossible to define, in unambiguous terms, what constitutes a game, and the same argument applies to all complex cultural concepts, including norms. Gray areas are ripe for cheaters to test the limits, play in the margins, and push the envelope. In the United States, for example, the Federal Communications Commission imposes fines on television networks for violating standards of public decency. But what's considered indecent? In Jacobellis v. Ohio, Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart refused to define obscenity, saying instead, "I know it when I see it, but this kind of underspecification is exactly what allows a norm to be skirted." The TV show Seinfeld was famous for pushing the boundaries of what could be discussed on network television. In one notorious episode, the characters made a bet to see who could hold out the longest without masturbating. And yet the word masturbate was very cleverly avoided throughout the show. Here's how the topic is introduced. "Jerry, what's the matter?" "George, my mother caught me." "Jerry, caught you? Doing what?" "George, you know. I was alone. I stopped by house to drop the car off, and I went inside for a few minutes. Nobody was there. They're supposed to be working. My mother had a glamour magazine. I started leafing through it. So, one thing lead to another. Is that indecent? I know it when I see it is a hard criterion to apply to cases like this, in part because it depends on how vividly the censor is imagining the actions implied by the dialogue. Other norms we like to skirt include dress codes, slacking off at work, flirting inappropriately, and acting politically in small social groups. Minor sins. People have many reasons to fixate on celebrities and other power players, but one reason is to see what celebrities can get away with. Steve Jobs was famously abusive to his staff at Apple. John F. Kennedy had more mistresses than historians can confirm. 20. J. Simpson seemingly got away with murder. We sometimes flatter ourselves that abusive CEOs and philandering presidents are a different breed of person from down-to-earth folks like us. But at least in the ways we evade norms, the difference is mostly a matter of degree. Celebrities may get away with violating big norms, but if a norm is weak enough, even everyday folks like us can violate it with impunity. So we brag and boast, shirk and slack off, gossip and badmouth people behind their backs. We undermine our supposed teammates, suck up to our bosses, ogle and flirt inappropriately, play politics, and manipulate others for our own ends. In short, we're selfish. Not irredeemably selfish, just slightly more than our highest standards of behavior demand. But of course we don't flaunt our selfishness. We don't gossip and shirk completely out in the open. When we brag, for example, we try to be subtle about it. It's crass to quote one's IQ or salary, but if those numbers are worth bragging about, we typically find a way to let our peers know, perhaps by using big, show-offy words or by buying conspicuous luxuries. We name drop and #humblebrag. We show off our bodies by wearing flattering clothes. Or we let others boast on our behalves, as when we're being introduced as speakers. We show similar discretion when we play small-scale politics, maneuvering for personal advantage in settings like church, the office, or our peer groups. We try to cultivate allies and undermine those who aren't allied with us. We angle to take credit for successes and avoid blame for failures. We lobby for policies that will benefit us, even when we have little reason to believe those policies will benefit the entire group. We tell people what they want to hear. But of course we don't do this out in the open. We don't say to our enemies, "I'm trying to undermine you right now." Instead, we cloak our actions in justifications that appeal to what's best for everyone. Getting our bearings. It takes a bit of cleverness to get away with cheating. This helps resolve the puzzle we identified at the end of Chapter 3. If norms are supposed to discourage competition, then why do we still need big brains? A plausible answer is that our norms are only partially enforced, so we need big brains to figure out how to cheat. In fact, norm-evaders and norm enforcers are locked in a competitive arms race of their own, a game of cat and mouse, pushing each other ever upward in mental ability. In the next chapter, we focus our attention on one particularly subtle and important form of cheating, self-deception. This will also address our book's central puzzle: why are we unconscious of some of our motives? 5. Self-deception. The red milk snake, utterly harmless, wears stripes to pose as a deadly coral snake. Some orchid species mimic other flowers in order to attract pollinating bees, but without providing any nectar in return. Dozens of species use eye spots to trick other animals into thinking they're being watched. Possums, lizards, birds, and sharks play dead, hoping to dissuade predators who are interested only in live prey. Even parasitic bacteria try to get in on the act, for example, by wearing certain molecules on their cell membranes in order to look like a native host cell, thereby fooling the host's immune system, a microscopic wolf in sheep's clothing. Deception, says the evolutionary biologist Robert Trivers, is a very deep feature of life. It occurs at all levels, from gene to cell to individual to group, and it seems, by any and all means, necessary. And our species, of course, is no exception. Suffice it to say that deception is simply part of human nature, a fact that makes perfect sense in light of the competitive logic of evolution. Deception allows us to reap certain benefits without paying the full costs. And yes, all societies have norms against lying, but that just means we have to work a little harder not to get caught. Instead of telling bald-faced lies, maybe we spin or cherry-pick the truth. So far, so obvious. But here's the puzzle: we don't just deceive others, we also deceive ourselves. Our minds habitually distort or ignore critical information in ways that seem, on the face of it, counterproductive. Our mental processes act in bad faith, perverting or degrading our picture of the world. In common speech, we might say that someone is engaged in wishful thinking or is burying her head in the sand, or, to use a more colorful phrase, that she's drinking her own Kool-Aid. In his book The Folly of Fools, Trivers refers to self-deception as the striking contradiction at the heart of our mental lives. Our brains seek out information, he says, and then act to destroy it. On the one hand, our sense organs have evolved to give us a marvelously detailed and accurate view of the outside world. Exactly as we would expect if truth about the outside world helps us to navigate it more effectively. But once this information arrives in our brains, it is often distorted and biased to our conscious minds. We deny the truth to ourselves. We project onto others traits that are in fact true of ourselves, and then attack them. We repress painful memories, create completely false ones, rationalize immoral behavior, act repeatedly to boost positive self-opinion, and show a suite of ego defense mechanisms. Point 3. We deceive ourselves in many different areas of life. One domain is sports. Consider how a boxer might purposely ignore an injury during a fight, or how a marathon runner might trick herself into thinking she's less fatigued than she really is. A study of competitive swimmers found that those who were more prone to self-deception performed better during an important qualifying race. Point 5. Another domain is personal health. You might suppose, given how important health is to our happiness, it would be a domain to which we'd bring our cognitive A game. Unfortunately, study after study shows that we often distort or ignore critical information about our own health in order to seem healthier than we really are. One study, for example, gave patients a cholesterol test, then followed up to see what they remembered months later. Patients with the worst test results, who were judged the most at risk of cholesterol-related health problems, were most likely to misremember their test results, and they remembered their results as better than they actually were. Smokers, but not non-smokers, choose not to hear about the dangerous effects of smoking. People systematically underestimate their risk of contracting HIV and avoid taking HIV tests. 10. We also deceive ourselves about our driving skills, social skills, leadership skills, and athletic ability. 11. These results are robust. There's a wide base of evidence showing that human brains are poor stewards of the information they receive from the outside world. But this seems entirely self-defeating, like shooting oneself in the foot. If our minds contain maps of our worlds, what good comes from having an inaccurate version of these maps? Old school, self-deception as defense. Broadly speaking, there are two schools of thought about why we deceive ourselves. The first, what we'll call the old school, treats self-deception as a defense mechanism. Sigmund Freud, along with his daughter Anna Freud, famously championed this school of thought. The Freuds saw self-deception as a coping strategy, a way for the ego to protect itself, especially against unwanted impulses. 12. We repress painful thoughts and memories, for example, by pushing them down into the subconscious. Or we deny our worst attributes and project them onto others. Or we rationalize, substituting good motives for ugly ones. According to the Freuds, the mind employs these defense mechanisms to reduce anxiety and other kinds of psychic pain. Later psychologists, following Otto Fenichel in the mid-20th century, reinterpreted the purpose of defense mechanisms as preserving one's self-esteem. 13. This has become the polite, common-sense explanation that we deceive ourselves because we can't handle the truth. Our egos and self-esteem are fragile and need to be shielded from distressing information, like the fact that we probably won't win the upcoming competition, or the fact that we may be sick with some lurking cancer. In a segment for the podcast Radiolab, Harold Sakiam, one of the first psychologists to experimentally study self-deception, explained it this way. Sakiam, see all the pain in the world, how horrible people are with each other, and they tell you everything about themselves, what their weaknesses are, what terrible things they've done to other people. And the problem is they're right. And so maybe the way we help people is to help them be wrong. Robert Krulwich, it might just be that hiding ideas that we know to be true, hiding those ideas from ourselves, is what we need to get by. Sakiam, we're so vulnerable to being hurt that we're given the capacity to distort as a gift. 14. Poetic, maybe, but this old school perspective ignores an important objection. Why would nature, by way of evolution, 15 design our brains this way? Information is the lifeblood of the human brain. Ignoring or distorting it isn't something to be undertaken lightly. If the goal is to preserve self-esteem, a more efficient way to go about it is simply to make the brain's self-esteem mechanism stronger, more robust to threatening information. Similarly, if the goal is to reduce anxiety, the straightforward solution is to design the brain to feel less anxiety for a given amount of stress. In contrast, using self-deception to preserve self-esteem or reduce anxiety is a sloppy hack and ultimately self-defeating. It would be like trying to warm yourself during winter by aiming a blow-dryer at the thermostat. The temperature reading will rise, but it won't reflect a properly heated house, and it won't stop you from shivering. 16. Alternatively, imagine you're the general in charge of a large army. You're outnumbered and surrounded by the enemy with no clear line of escape. As you contemplate your next move on a large paper map, you realize how easy it would be to erase the mountain range that's blocking your troops, or to draw a pass through the mountains where none actually exists. Having an escape route would certainly be a relief. But the map isn't the territory. You can't erase the actual mountains. Whatever you do to the map, the enemy will still have you surrounded. And by lying about reality, you're setting yourself up to make bad decisions that will lead to even worse outcomes. A general who made a habit of indulging in such flights of fancy would quickly lose the war to one who didn't. And the same is true for our minds. We therefore need a better reason for deceiving ourselves than mere psychic comfort. New school, self-deception as manipulation. In recent years, psychologists, especially those who focus on evolutionary reasoning, have developed a more satisfying explanation for why we deceive ourselves. Where the old school saw self-deception as primarily inward-facing, defensive, and largely self-defeating, the new school sees it as primarily outward-facing, manipulative, and ultimately self-serving. Two recent new school books have been Travers' The Folly of Fools and Robert Kurzban's Why Everyone is a Hypocrite. But the roots of the new school go back to Thomas Schelling, a Nobel Prize-winning economist, 17 best known for his work on the game theory of cooperation and conflict. In his 1967 book The Strategy of Conflict, Schelling studied what he called mixed motive games. These are scenarios involving two or more players whose interests overlap but also partially diverge. Thanks to the overlap, the players have an incentive to cooperate, but thanks to the divergence, they're also somewhat at odds with each other. If this sounds familiar, it's because humans have been playing mixed motive games with each other for millions of years. It's what we do every day, what our minds were built for. Nevertheless, as Schelling demonstrated, mixed motive games can incentivize strange, counterintuitive behavior. A classic example is the game of chicken, typically played by two teenagers in their cars. The players race toward each other on a collision course, and the player who swerves first loses the game. Point 18. Traditionally, it's a game of bravado. But if you really want to win, here's what Schelling advises. When you're lined up facing your opponent, revving your engine, remove the steering wheel from your car and wave it at your opponent. This way, he'll know that you're locked in, dead set, hell-bent, irrevocably committed to driving straight through, no matter what. And at this point, unless he wants to die, your opponent will have to swerve first, and you'll be the winner. The reason this is counterintuitive is because it's not typically a good idea to limit our own options. But Schelling documented how the perverse incentives of mixed motive games lead to option limiting and other actions that seem irrational, but are actually strategic. These include closing or degrading a channel of communication. You might purposely turn off your phone, for example, if you're expecting someone to call asking for a favor. Or you might have a hard conversation over email rather than in person. Opening oneself up to future punishment. Among the legal privileges of corporations, writes Schelling, two that are mentioned in textbooks are the right to sue and the right to be sued. Who wants to be sued? But the right to be sued is the power to make a promise, to borrow money, to enter a contract, to do business with someone who might be damaged. If suit does arise, the right seems a liability in retrospect. Beforehand it was a prerequisite to doing business. 19. Ignoring information, also known as strategic ignorance. If you're kidnapped, for example, you might prefer not to see your kidnapper's face or learn his name. Why? Because if he knows you can identify him later, he'll be less likely to let you go. In some cases, knowledge can be a serious liability. Purposely believing something that's false. If you're a general who firmly believes your army can win, even though the odds are against it, you might nevertheless intimidate your opponent into backing down. In other words, mixed motive games contain the kind of incentives that reward self-deception. There's a tension in all of this. In simple applications of decision theory, it's better to have more options and more knowledge. Yet Schelling has argued that, in a variety of scenarios, limiting or sabotaging yourself is the winning move. What gives? Resolving this tension turns out to be straightforward. Classical decision theory has it right. There's no value in sabotaging yourself per se. The value lies in convincing other players that you've sabotaged yourself. In the game of chicken, you don't win because you're unable to steer, but because your opponent believes you're unable to steer. Similarly, as a kidnapping victim, you don't suffer because you've seen your kidnapper's face. You suffer when the kidnapper thinks you've seen his face. If you could somehow see his face without giving him any idea that you'd done so, you'd probably be better off. By this line of reasoning, it's never useful to have secret gaps in your knowledge, or to adopt false beliefs that you keep entirely to yourself. The entire value of strategic ignorance and related phenomena lies in the way others act when they believe that you're ignorant. As Kurzban says, ignorance is at its most useful when it is most public. 20. It needs to be advertised and made conspicuous. Another way to look at it is that self-deception is useful only when you're playing against an opponent who can take your mental state into account. You can't bluff the blind forces of nature. For example, when a hurricane is roaring toward you, it's no use trying to ignore it. The hurricane couldn't care less whether or not you know it's coming. Sabotaging yourself works only when you're playing against an opponent with a theory of mind. Typically, these opponents will be other humans, but it could theoretically extend to some of the smarter animals, as well as hypothetical future robots or aliens. Corporations and nation-states also use some of these self-sabotaging tactics vis-a-vis each other and the public at large. Self-deception, then, is a tactic that's useful only to social creatures in social situations. It's hard to overstate the impact of what Schelling, Trivers, Kurzban, and others are arguing. Their conclusion is that we, humans, must self-deceive. Those who refuse to play such mind games will be at a game-theoretic disadvantage relative to others who play along. Thus we are often wise to ignore seemingly critical information and to believe easily refuted falsehoods, and then to prominently advertise our distorted thinking, because these are winning moves. As Trivers puts it, we deceive ourselves the better to deceive others. 21. Why do we believe our own lies? Still, there's an important lingering question. If the goal of self-deception is to create a certain impression in others, why do we distort the truth to ourselves? What's the benefit of self-deception over a simple, deliberate lie? There are many ways to answer this question, but they mostly boil down to the fact that lying is hard to pull off. For one thing, it's cognitively demanding. Huckleberry Finn, for example, struggled to keep his story straight and was eventually caught in a number of lies. And it's even harder when we're being grilled and expected to produce answers quickly. As Mark Twain may have said elsewhere, if you tell the truth, you don't have to remember anything. 22 Beyond the cognitive demands, lying is also difficult because we have to overcome our fear of getting caught. People get angry when they're lied to, a reaction almost as universal as lying itself. Therefore, aside from sociopaths and compulsive liars, most of us are afraid to tell bald-faced lies, and we suffer from a number of fear-based tells that can give us away. Our hearts race, our skin heats up, we start sweating and fidgeting. Maybe we have an eye twitch, nervous tick, awkward gulp, or cracking voice. Point 24. In light of this, often the best way to get others to believe something is to make it a reality. When you're playing chicken, it won't do much good to yell at your opponent, "Hey, I've torn off my steering wheel." He won't believe you until he sees that you've actually done it. Similarly, often the best way to convince others that we believe something is to actually believe it. Other people aren't stupid. They're aware that we often have an incentive to lie to them, so they're watching us, eagle-eyed, for any signs of deception. They're analyzing our words, scrutinizing our facial expressions, and observing our behaviors to make sure they conform to our stated motives. The point is, our minds aren't as private as we like to imagine. Other people have partial visibility into what we're thinking. Faced with the translucency of our own minds, then, self-deception is often the most robust way to mislead others. It's not technically a lie, but it has a similar effect. We hide reality from our conscious minds, says Trivers, the better to hide it from onlookers. 25 Modeling the world accurately isn't the be-all and end-all of the human brain. Brains evolved to help our bodies, and ultimately our genes, get along and get ahead in the world, a world that includes not just rocks and squirrels and hurricanes, but also other human beings. And if we spend a significant fraction of our lives interacting with others, trying to convince them of certain things, why shouldn't our brains adopt socially useful beliefs as first-class citizens alongside world-modeling beliefs? Wear a mask long enough and it becomes your face. Point 26. Play a role long enough and it becomes who you are. Spend enough time pretending something is true and you might as well believe it. 27. Incidentally, this is why politicians make a great case study for self-deception. The social pressure on their beliefs is enormous. Psychologically, then, politicians don't so much lie as regurgitate their own self-deceptions. Point 28. Both are ways of misleading others, but self-deceptions are a lot harder to catch and prosecute. Self-deception in practice. There are at least 4 ways that self-deception helps us come out ahead in mixed-motive scenarios. We'll personify them in 4 different archetypes: the madman, the loyalist, the cheerleader, and the cheater. The madman. "I'm doing this no matter what," says the madman, "so stay out of my way." When we commit ourselves to a particular course of action, it often changes the incentives for other players. This is how removing the steering wheel helps us win the game of chicken, but it's also why business people, gang leaders, athletes, and other competitors try to psych out their opponents. Rick Lahey explains how athletes suffer when they don't play the madman. Athletes use small cues of tiredness from close competitors to give themselves a boost and keep pushing forward during a race. Because of this, athletes conceal information about to competitors. If you show any signs of weakness, the opponent will see a chance for success and will be more willing to keep spending energy. Point 29. It was also one of Richard Nixon's strategies for the war in Vietnam. As he explained to his chief of staff Bob Haldeman, "I call it the madman theory, Bob. I want the North Vietnamese to believe I've reached the point where I might do anything to stop the war. We'll just slip the word to them that, for God's sake, you know Nixon is obsessed about communism. We can't restrain him when he's angry, and he has his hand on the nuclear button, and Ho Chi Minh himself will be in Paris in 2 days begging for peace. Point 30. Of course, Nixon's plan didn't work out as well as he hoped, but his reasoning was valid. People often defer to the crazy ones, and our minds respond to that incentive by being a little bit crazy ourselves. The loyalist. "Sure, I'll go along with your beliefs," says the loyalist, thereby demonstrating commitment and hoping to earn trust in return. In many ways, belief is a political act. This is why we're typically keen to believe a friend's version of a story about a breakup, say, or a dispute at work, even when we know there's another side of the story that may be equally compelling. It's also why blind faith is an important virtue for religious groups and to a lesser extent social, professional, and political groups. When a group's fundamental tenets are at stake, those who demonstrate the most steadfast commitment, who continue to chant the loudest or clench their eyes the tightest in the face of conflicting evidence, earn the most trust from their fellow group members. The employee who drinks the company Kool-Aid, however epistemically noxious, will tend to win favor from colleagues, especially in management, and move faster up the chain. In fact, we often measure loyalty in our relationships by the degree to which a belief is irrational or unwarranted by the evidence. For example, we don't consider it loyal for an employee to stay at a company when it's paying her twice the salary she could make elsewhere. That's just calculated self-interest. Likewise, it's not loyal for a man to stay with his girlfriend if he has no other prospects. These attachments take on the color of loyalty only when someone remains committed despite a strong temptation to defect. Similarly, it doesn't demonstrate loyalty to believe the truth, which we have every incentive to believe anyway. It only demonstrates loyalty to believe something that we wouldn't have reason to believe unless we were loyal. There's a famous Chinese parable illustrating the loyalist function of our beliefs. Zhao Gao was a powerful man hungry for more power. One day he brought a deer to a meeting with the emperor and many top officials, calling the deer a great horse. The emperor, who regarded Zhao Gao as a teacher and therefore trusted him completely, agreed that it was a horse, and many officials agreed as well. Others, however, remained silent or objected. This was how Zhao Gao flushed out his enemies. Soon after, he murdered all the officials who refused to call the deer a horse. 31. Zhao Gao's ploy wouldn't have worked if he had called the deer a deer. The truth is a poor litmus test of loyalty. The cheerleader. I know this is true, the cheerleader says. Come on, believe it with me. This kind of self-deception is a form of propaganda. As Kurzban writes, sometimes it is beneficial to be wrong in such a way that, if everyone else believed the incorrect thing one believes, one would be strategically better off. 32. The goal of cheerleading, then, is to change other people's beliefs. And the more fervently we believe something, the easier it is to convince others that it's true. The politician who's confident she's going to win no matter what will have an easier time rallying supporters than one who projects a more honest assessment of her chances. The startup founder who's brimming with confidence, though it may be entirely unearned, will often attract more investors and recruit more employees than someone with an accurate assessment of his own abilities. When we deceive ourselves about personal health, whether by avoiding information entirely or by distorting information we've already received, it feels like we're trying to protect ourselves from distressing information. But the reason our egos need to be shielded, the reason we evolve to feel pain when our egos are threatened, is to help us maintain a positive social impression. We don't personally benefit from misunderstanding our current state of health, but we benefit when others mistakenly believe we're healthy. And the first step to convincing others is often to convince ourselves. As Bill Atkinson, a colleague of Steve Jobs, once said of Jobs' self-deception, it allowed him to con people into believing his vision because he has personally embraced and internalized it. 33. The cheater. I have no idea what you're talking about, the cheater says in response to an accusation. My motives were pure. As we discussed in Chapter 3, many norms hinge on the actor's intentions. Being nice, for example, is generally applauded, but being nice with the intention to curry favor is the sin of flattery. Similarly, being friendly is generally considered to be a good thing, but being friendly with romantic intentions is flirting, which is often inappropriate. Other minor sins that hinge on intent include bragging, showing off, sucking up, lying, and playing politics, as well as selfish behavior in general. When we deceive ourselves about our own motives, however, it becomes much harder for others to prosecute these minor transgressions. We'll see much more of this in the next chapter. In other cases, it's not our intentions that determine whether a norm was violated, but our knowledge. Learning about a transgression sometimes invokes a moral or legal duty to do something about it. 34. If we see a friend shoplift, we become complicit in the crime. This is why we might turn a blind eye or strive to retain plausible deniability, so that, when questioned later, we'll have nothing to hide. Again, in all of these cases, self-deception works because other people are attempting to read our minds and react based on what they find. In deceiving ourselves, then, we're often acting to deceive and manipulate others. We might be hoping to intimidate them, earn their trust, change their beliefs, or throw them off our trail. Of course, these aren't mutually exclusive. Any particular act of self-deception might serve multiple purposes at once. When the mother of an alleged murderer is convinced that her son is innocent, she's playing loyalist to her son and cheerleader to the jury. The prizefighter who is grossly overconfident about his odds of winning is playing both cheerleader and madman. Modularity. The benefit of self-deception is that it can, in some scenarios, help us mislead others. But what about its costs? As we've mentioned, the main cost is that it leads to suboptimal decision-making. Like the general who erases the mountain range on the map, then leads the army to a dead end, self-deceivers similarly run the risk of acting on false or missing information. Luckily, however, we don't have to bear the full brunt of our own deceptions. Typically, at least part of our brain continues to know the truth. In other words, our saving grace is inconsistency. To understand most important ideas in psychology, says social psychologist Jonathan Haidt in the happiness hypothesis, you need to understand how the mind is divided into parts that sometimes conflict. He goes on, we assume that there is one person in each body, but in some ways we are each more like a committee, whose members have been thrown together working at cross purposes. Point 35. There are dozens of schemes for how to divide up the mind. The Bible identifies the head and the heart. Freud gives us the ID, ego, and superego. Ian McGilchrist differentiates the analytical left brain from the holistic right brain, 36, while Douglas Kenrick gives us 7 subselves: night watchman, compulsive hypochondriac, team player, go-getter, swinging single, good spouse, and nurturing parent. 37. Meanwhile, the next generation is growing up on Pixar's Inside Out, which portrays the mind as a committee of 5 different emotional personalities. None of these schemes is unequivocally better or more accurate than the others. They're just different ways of slicing up the same complex system, the reality of which is even more fragmented than the committee metaphor suggests. Psychologists call this modularity. Instead of a single monolithic process or small committee, modern psychologists see the brain as a patchwork of hundreds or thousands of different parts or modules, each responsible for a slightly different information processing task. Some modules take care of low-level tasks like detecting edges in the visual field or flexing a muscle. Others are responsible for medium-sized operations like walking and conjugating verbs. Still higher-level modules are responsible for things like detecting cheaters. 38 and managing our social impressions. The point is that there are many different systems in the brain, each connected to other systems, but also partially isolated from each other. The artificial intelligence researcher Marvin Minsky famously described this arrangement as the society of mind. 39 And like a society, there are different ways to carve it up for different purposes. Just as America can be broken down in terms of political factions, geography, or generations, the mind can also be carved up in many different ways. And crucially, as Haidt stressed, the different parts don't always agree. A fact might be known to one system and yet be completely concealed or cut off from other systems. Or different systems might contain mutually inconsistent models of the world. This is illustrated rather dramatically by the rare but well-documented condition known as blindsight, which typically follows from some kind of brain damage, like a stroke to the visual cortex. Just like people who are conventionally blind, blind-sighted patients swear they can't see. But when presented with flashcards and forced to guess what's on the card, they do better than chance. Clearly, some parts of their brains are registering visual information, even if the parts responsible for conscious awareness are kept in the dark. 40 What this means for self-deception is that it's possible for our brains to maintain a relatively accurate set of beliefs and systems tasked with evaluating potential actions, while keeping those accurate beliefs hidden from the systems involved in managing social impressions. In other words, we can act on information that isn't available to our verbal, conscious egos. And conversely, we can believe something with our conscious egos without necessarily making that information available to the systems charged with coordinating our behavior. No matter how fervently a person believes in heaven, for example, she's still going to be afraid of death. This is because the deepest, oldest parts of her brain, those charged with self-preservation, haven't the slightest idea about the afterlife. Nor should they. Self-preservation systems have no business dealing with abstract concepts. They should run on autopilot and be extremely difficult to override. This sort of division of mental labor is simply good mind design. As psychologists Douglas Kenrick and Vladas Griskevicius put it, although we're aware of some of the surface motives for our actions, the deep-seated evolutionary motives often remain inaccessible, buried behind the scenes in the subconscious workings of our brain's ancient mechanisms. 42 Thus the very architecture of our brains makes it possible for us to behave hypocritically, to believe one set of things while acting on another. We can know and remain ignorant as long as it's in separate parts of the brain. Point 43. Self-discretion. Self-discretion is perhaps the most important and subtle mind game that we play with ourselves in the service of manipulating others. This is our mental habit of giving less psychological prominence to potentially damaging information. It differs from the most blatant forms of self-deception, in which we actively lie to ourselves. It also differs from strategic ignorance, in which we try our best not to learn potentially dangerous information. Picture the mind as a society of little modules, systems, and subselves chattering away among themselves. This chatter is largely what constitutes our inner mental life, both conscious and unconscious. Self-discretion, then, consists of discretion among different brain parts. When part of the brain has to process a sensitive piece of information, wanting to get the upper hand in a particular interaction, for example, it doesn't necessarily make a big conscious fuss about it. Instead, we might just feel vaguely uneasy until we've gained the upper hand, whereupon we'll feel comfortable ending the conversation. At no point does the motive get the upper hand rise to full conscious attention, but the same result is accomplished discreetly. Information is sensitive in part because it can threaten our self-image and therefore our social image. So the rest of the brain conspires, whispers, to keep such information from becoming too prominent, especially in consciousness. In this sense, the Freuds were right, the conscious ego needs to be protected. But not because we are fragile, but rather to keep damaging information from leaking out of our brain and into the minds of our associates. Self-discretion can be very subtle. When we push a thought deep down or to the back of our minds, it's a way of being discreet with potentially damaging information. When we spend more time and attention dwelling on positive, self-flattering information, and less time and attention dwelling on shameful information, that's self-discretion. Think about that time you wrote an amazing article for the school paper, or gave that killer wedding speech. Did you feel a flush of pride? That's your brain telling you, this information is good for us. Let's keep it prominent, front and center. Dwell on it, bask in its warm glow. Reward those neural pathways in the hope of resurfacing those proud memories whenever they're relevant. Now think about the time you mistreated your significant other, or when you were caught stealing as a child, or when you botched a big presentation at work. Feel the pang of shame? That's your brain telling you not to dwell on that particular information. Flinch away, hide from it, pretend it's not there. Punish those neural pathways so the information stays as discreet as possible. Point 44. Getting our bearings. In summary, our minds are built to sabotage information in order to come out ahead in social games. When big parts of our minds are unaware of how we try to violate social norms, it's more difficult for others to detect and prosecute those violations. This also makes it harder for us to calculate optimal behaviors, but overall, the trade-off is worth it. Of all the things we might be self-deceived about, the most important are our own motives. It's this special form of self-deception that we turn to in the next chapter. In many ways, belief is a political act. This is why we're typically keen to believe a friend's version of a story about a breakup, say, or a dispute at work, even when we know there's another side of the story that may be equally compelling. It's also why blind faith is an important virtue for religious groups and to a lesser extent social, professional, and political groups. When a group's fundamental tenets are at stake, those who demonstrate the most steadfast commitment, who continue to chant the loudest or clench their eyes the tightest in the face of conflicting evidence, earn the most trust from their fellow group members. The employee who drinks the company Kool-Aid, however epistemically noxious, will tend to win favor from colleagues, especially in management, and move faster up the chain. In fact, we often measure loyalty in our relationships by the degree to which a belief is irrational or unwarranted by the evidence. For example, we don't consider it loyal for an employee to stay at a company when it's paying her twice the salary she could make elsewhere. That's just calculated self-interest. Likewise, it's not loyal for a man to stay with his girlfriend if he has no other prospects. These attachments take on the color of loyalty only when someone remains committed despite a strong temptation to defect. Similarly, it doesn't demonstrate loyalty to believe the truth, which we have every incentive to believe anyway. It only demonstrates loyalty to believe something that we wouldn't have reason to believe unless we were loyal. There's a famous Chinese parable illustrating the loyalist function of our beliefs. Zhao Gao was a powerful man hungry for more power. One day he brought a deer to a meeting with the emperor and many top officials, calling the deer a great horse. The emperor, who regarded Zhao Gao as a teacher and therefore trusted him completely, agreed that it was a horse, and many officials agreed as well. Others, however, remained silent or objected. This was how Zhao Gao flushed out his enemies. Soon after, he murdered all the officials who refused to call the deer a horse. 31. Zhao Gao's ploy wouldn't have worked if he had called the deer a deer. The truth is a poor litmus test of loyalty. The cheerleader. I know this is true, the cheerleader says. Come on, believe it with me. This kind of self-deception is a form of propaganda. As Kurzban writes, sometimes it is beneficial to be wrong in such a way that, if everyone else believed the incorrect thing one believes, one would be strategically better off. 32. The goal of cheerleading, then, is to change other people's beliefs. And the more fervently we believe something, the easier it is to convince others that it's true. The politician who's confident she's going to win no matter what will have an easier time rallying supporters than one who projects a more honest assessment of her chances. The startup founder who's brimming with confidence, though it may be entirely unearned, will often attract more investors and recruit more employees than someone with an accurate assessment of his own abilities. When we deceive ourselves about personal health, whether by avoiding information entirely or by distorting information we've already received, it feels like we're trying to protect ourselves from distressing information. But the reason our egos need to be shielded, the reason we evolved to feel pain when our egos are threatened, is to help us maintain a positive social impression. We don't personally benefit from misunderstanding our current state of health, but we benefit when others mistakenly believe we're healthy. And the first step to convincing others is often to convince ourselves. As Bill Atkinson, a colleague of Steve Jobs, once said of Jobs' self-deception, it allowed him to con people into believing his vision because he has personally embraced and internalized it. 33. The cheater. I have no idea what you're talking about, the cheater says in response to an accusation. My motives were pure. As we discussed in Chapter 3, many norms hinge on the actor's intentions. Being nice, for example, is generally applauded, but being nice with the intention to curry favor is the sin of flattery. Similarly, being friendly is generally considered to be a good thing, but being friendly with romantic intentions is flirting, which is often inappropriate. Other minor sins that hinge on intent include bragging, showing off, sucking up, lying, and playing politics, as well as selfish behavior in general. When we deceive ourselves about our own motives, however, it becomes much harder for others to prosecute these minor transgressions. We'll see much more of this in the next chapter. In other cases, it's not our intentions that determine whether a norm was violated, but our knowledge. Learning about a transgression sometimes invokes a moral or legal duty to do something about it. 34. If we see a friend shoplift, we become complicit in the crime. This is why we might turn a blind eye or strive to retain plausible deniability, so that, when questioned later, we'll have nothing to hide. Again, in all of these cases, self-deception works because other people are attempting to read our minds and react based on what they find. In deceiving ourselves, then, we're often acting to deceive and manipulate others. We might be hoping to intimidate them, earn their trust, change their beliefs, or throw them off our trail. Of course, these aren't mutually exclusive. Any particular act of self-deception might serve multiple purposes at once. When the mother of an alleged murderer is convinced that her son is innocent, she's playing loyalist to her son and cheerleader to the jury. The prizefighter who is grossly overconfident about his odds of winning is playing both cheerleader and madman. Modularity. The benefit of self-deception is that it can, in some scenarios, help us mislead others. But what about its costs? As we've mentioned, the main cost is that it leads to suboptimal decision-making. Like the general who erases the mountain range on the map, then leads the army to a dead end, self-deceivers similarly run the risk of acting on false or missing information. Luckily, however, we don't have to bear the full brunt of our own deceptions. Typically, at least part of our brain continues to know the truth. In other words, our saving grace is inconsistency. To understand most important ideas in psychology, says social psychologist Jonathan Haidt in The Happiness Hypothesis, you need to understand how the mind is divided into parts that sometimes conflict. He goes on, we assume that there is one person in each body, but in some ways we are each more like a committee, whose members have been thrown together working at cross purposes. 35. There are dozens of schemes for how to divide up the mind. The Bible identifies the head and the heart. Freud gives us the ID, ego, and superego. Ian McGilchrist differentiates the analytical left brain from the holistic right brain. 36. While Douglas Kenrick gives us 7 subcells: night watchman, compulsive hypochondriac, team player, go-getter, swinging single, good spouse, and nurturing parent. 37. Meanwhile, the next generation is growing up on Pixar's Inside Out, which portrays the mind as a committee of 5 different emotional personalities. None of these schemes is unequivocally better or more accurate than the others. They're just different ways of slicing up the same complex system, the reality of which is even more fragmented than the committee metaphor suggests. Psychologists call this modularity. Instead of a single monolithic process or small committee, modern psychologists see the brain as a patchwork of hundreds or thousands of different parts or modules, each responsible for a slightly different information processing task. Some modules take care of low-level tasks like detecting edges in the visual field or flexing a muscle. Others are responsible for medium-sized operations like walking and conjugating verbs. Still higher-level modules are responsible for things like detecting cheaters 38 and managing our social impressions. The point is that there are many different systems in the brain, each connected to other systems but also partially isolated from each other. The artificial intelligence researcher Marvin Minsky famously described this arrangement as the society of mind. 39. And like a society, there are different ways to carve it up for different purposes. Just as America can be broken down in terms of political factions, geography, or generations, the mind can also be carved up in many different ways. And crucially, as Haidt stressed, the different parts don't always agree. A fact might be known to one system and yet be completely concealed or cut off from other systems. Or different systems might contain mutually inconsistent models of the world. This is illustrated rather dramatically by the rare but well-documented condition known as blindsight, which typically follows from some kind of brain damage, like a stroke to the visual cortex. Just like people who are conventionally blind, blind-sighted patients swear they can't see. But when presented with flashcards and forced to guess what's on the card, they do better than chance. Clearly, some parts of their brains are registering even if the parts responsible for conscious awareness are kept in the dark. 40. What this means for self-deception is that it's possible for our brains to maintain a relatively accurate set of beliefs and systems tasked with evaluating potential actions, while keeping those accurate beliefs hidden from the systems involved in managing social impressions. In other words, we can act on information that isn't available to our verbal, conscious egos. And conversely, we can believe something with our conscious egos without necessarily making that information available to the systems charged with coordinating our behavior. No matter how fervently a person believes in heaven, for example, she's still going to be afraid of death. This is because the deepest, oldest parts of her brain, those charged with self-preservation, haven't the slightest idea about the afterlife. Nor should they. Self-preservation systems have no business dealing with abstract concepts. They should run on autopilot and be extremely difficult to override. This sort of division of mental labor is simply good mind design. As psychologists Douglas Kenrick and Vladas Griskovicius put it, although we're aware of some of the surface motives for our actions, the deep-seated evolutionary motives often remain inaccessible, buried behind the scenes in the subconscious workings of our brain's ancient mechanisms. 42 Thus the very architecture of our brains makes it possible for us to behave hypocritically, to believe one set of things while acting on another. We can know and remain ignorant, as long as it's in separate parts of the brain. 43. Self-discretion. Self-discretion is perhaps the most important and subtle mind game that we play with ourselves in the service of manipulating others. This is our mental habit of giving less psychological prominence to potentially damaging information. It differs from the most blatant forms of self-deception, in which we actively lie to ourselves. It also differs from strategic ignorance, in which we try our best not to learn potentially dangerous information. Picture the mind as a society of little modules, systems, and subselves chattering away among themselves. This chatter is largely what constitutes our inner mental life, both conscious and unconscious. Self-discretion, then, consists of discretion among different brain parts. When part of the brain has to process a sensitive piece of information, wanting to get the upper hand in a particular interaction, for example, it doesn't necessarily make a big conscious fuss about it. Instead, we might just feel vaguely uneasy until we've gained the upper hand, whereupon we'll feel comfortable ending the conversation. At no point does the motive get the upper hand rise to full conscious attention, but the same result is accomplished discreetly. Information is sensitive in part because it can threaten our self-image and therefore our social image. So the rest of the brain conspires, whispers, to keep such information from becoming too prominent, especially in consciousness. In this sense, the Freuds were right. The conscious ego needs to be protected, but not because we are fragile, but rather to keep damaging information from leaking out of our brain and into the minds of our associates. Self-discretion can be very subtle. When we push a thought deep down or to the back of our minds, it's a way of being discreet with potentially damaging information. When we spend more time and attention dwelling on positive, self-flattering information, and less time and attention dwelling on shameful information, that's self-discretion. Think about that time you wrote an amazing article for the school paper or gave that killer wedding speech. Did you feel a flush of pride? That's your brain telling you, this information is good for us. Let's keep it prominent, front and center. Dwell on it, bask in its warm glow. Reward those neural pathways in the hope of resurfacing those proud memories whenever they're relevant. Now think about the time you mistreated your significant other, or when you were caught stealing as a child, or when you botched a big presentation at work. Feel the pang of shame? That's your brain telling you not to dwell on that particular information. Flinch away, hide from it, pretend it's not there. Punish those neural pathways so the information stays as discreet as possible. 44. Getting our bearings. In summary, our minds are built to sabotage information in order to come out ahead in social games. When big parts of our minds are unaware of how we try to violate social norms, it's more difficult for others to detect and prosecute those violations. This also makes it harder for us to calculate optimal behaviors, but overall, the trade-off is worth it. Of all the things we might be self-deceived about, the most important are our own motives. It's this special form of self-deception that we turn to in the next chapter. 6. Counterfeit reasons. Reason is the slave of the passions, and can never pretend to any other office than to serve and obey them. David Hume 1. A man always has two reasons for doing anything, a good reason and the real reason. J. P. Morgan 2. Let's briefly take stock of the argument we've been making so far. In Chapter 2, we saw how humans are locked in the game of natural selection, which often rewards selfish, competitive behavior. In Chapter 3, we looked at social norms and saw how they constrain our selfish impulses, but also how norms can be fragile and hard to enforce. In Chapter 4, we looked at the many and subtle ways that humans try to cheat by exploiting the fragility of norm enforcement, largely by being discreet about bad behavior. In Chapter 5, we took a closer look at the most subtle and intriguing of all these norm evasion techniques, self-deception. We deceive ourselves, as Robert Travers says, the better to deceive others, in particular, to make it harder for others to catch and prosecute us for behaving badly. Together, these instincts and predispositions make up the elephant in the brain. They're the facts about ourselves, our behaviors, and our minds that we're uncomfortable acknowledging and confronting directly. It's not that we're entirely or irredeemably selfish and self-deceived, just that we're often rewarded for acting on selfish impulses, but less so for acknowledging them, and that our brains respond predictably to those incentives. In this chapter, we turn our attention to one particular type of self-deception, the fact that we're strategically ignorant about our own motives. In other words, we don't always know the whys behind our own behavior. But as we'll see, we certainly pretend to know. I wanted to go get a Coke. In the 1960s and early 1970s, neuroscientists Roger Sperry and Michael Gazzaniga conducted some of the most profound research in the history of psychology, a series of experiments that would launch Gazzaniga into an illustrious career as the grandfather of cognitive neuroscience, and for which Sperry would eventually win the Nobel Prize in 1981. In terms of method, the experiments were fairly conventional. An image was flashed, some questions were asked, that sort of thing. What distinguished these experiments were their subjects. These were patients who had previously, for medical reasons, undergone a corpus callosotomy, a surgical severing of the nerves that connect the left and right hemispheres of the brain. Hence the nickname for these subjects, split-brain patients. Until Sperry and Gazzaniga's experiments, no one had noticed anything particularly strange about split-brain patients. They were able to walk around leading seemingly normal lives. Neither their doctors nor their loved ones, nor the patients themselves, had noticed that much was amiss. But things were amiss, in a rather peculiar way, as Sperry and Gazzaniga were about to find out. In order to understand their research, it helps to be familiar with two basic facts about the brain. The first is that each hemisphere processes signals from the opposite side of the body. So the left hemisphere controls the right side of the body, while the right hemisphere controls the left side of the body. This is also true for signals from the ears. The left hemisphere processes sound from the right ear, and vice versa. With the eyes, it's a bit more complicated, but the upshot is that when a patient is looking straight ahead, everything to the right, and the right half of the visual field, is processed by the left hemisphere, and everything to the left is processed by the right hemisphere. 4. The second key fact is that, after a brain is split by a callosotomy, the two hemispheres can no longer share information with each other. In a normal brain, information flows smoothly back and forth between the hemispheres, but in a split brain, each hemisphere becomes an island unto itself, almost like two separate people within a single skull. 5. Now, what Sperry and Gazzaniga did, in a variety of different experimental setups, was ask the right hemisphere to do something, but then ask the left hemisphere to explain it. In one setup, they flashed a split-brain patient two different pictures at the same time, one to each hemisphere. The left hemisphere, for example, saw a picture of a chicken while the right hemisphere saw a picture of a snowy field. The researchers then asked the patient to reach out with his left hand and point to a word that best matched the picture he had seen. Since the right hemisphere had seen the picture of the snowy field, the left hand pointed to a shovel because a shovel goes nicely with snow. No surprises here. But then the researchers asked the patient to explain why he had chosen the shovel. Explanations, and speech generally, are functions of the left hemisphere, and thus the researchers were putting the left hemisphere in an awkward position. The right hemisphere alone had seen the snowy field, and it was the right hemisphere's unilateral decision to point to the shovel. The left hemisphere, meanwhile, had been left completely out of the loop, but was being asked to justify a decision it took no part in and wasn't privy to. From the point of view of the left hemisphere, the only legitimate answer would have been, "I don't know." But that's not the answer it gave. Instead, the left hemisphere said it had chosen the shovel because shovels are used for cleaning out the chicken coop. In other words, the left hemisphere, lacking a real reason to give, made up a reason on the spot. It pretended that it had acted on its own, that it had chosen the shovel because of the chicken picture. And it delivered this answer casually and matter-of-factly, fully expecting to be believed, because it had no idea it was making up a story. The left hemisphere, says Gazzaniga, did not offer its suggestion in a guessing vein, but rather as a statement of fact. 6. In another setup, Sperry and Gazzaniga asked the patient, by way of his right hemisphere, to stand up and walk toward the door. Once the patient was out of his chair, they then asked him, out loud, what he was doing, which required a response from his left hemisphere. Again, this put the left hemisphere in an awkward position. Now, we know why the patient got out of his chair, because the researchers asked him to, via his right hemisphere. The patient's left hemisphere, however, had no way of knowing this. But instead of saying, "I don't know why I stood up," which would have been the only honest answer, it made up a reason and fobbed it off as the truth. "I wanted to go get a Coke." Rationalization. What these studies demonstrate is just how effortlessly the brain can rationalize its behavior. Rationalization, sometimes known to neuroscientists as confabulation, is the production of fabricated stories made up without any conscious intention to deceive. They're not lies, exactly, but neither are they the honest truth. Humans rationalize about all sorts of things: beliefs, memories, statements of fact about the outside world. But few things seem as easy for us to rationalize as our own motives. When we make up stories about things outside our minds, we open ourselves up to fact-checking. People can argue with us, "Actually, that's not what happened." But when we make up stories about our own motives, it's much harder for others to question us, outside of a psychology lab, at least. And as we saw in Chapter 3, we have strong incentives to portray our motives in a flattering light, especially when they're the subject of norm enforcement. Rationalization is a kind of epistemic forgery, if you will. When others ask us to give reasons for our behavior, they're asking about our true, underlying motives. So when we rationalize or confabulate, we're handing out counterfeit reasons. We're presenting them as an honest account of our mental machinations, when in fact they're made up from scratch. Box 5, Motives and Reasons. When we use the term motives, we're referring to the underlying causes of our behavior, whether we're conscious of them or not. Reasons are the verbal explanations we give to account for our behavior. Reasons can be true, false, or somewhere in between. Even more dramatic examples of rationalization can be elicited from patients suffering from disability denial, a rare disorder that occasionally results from a right hemisphere stroke. In a typical case, the stroke will leave the patient's left arm paralyzed, but here's the weird part: the patient will completely deny that anything is wrong with his arm, and will manufacture all sorts of strange excuses for why it's just sitting there, limp and lifeless. The neuroscientist V. S. Ramachandran recalls some of the conceptual gymnastics his patients have undertaken in this situation. "Oh, doctor, I didn't want to move my arm because I have arthritis in my shoulder and it hurts." Or this is from another patient: "Oh, the medical students have been prodding me all day and I don't really feel like moving my arm just now." When asked to raise both hands, one man raised his right hand high into the air and said, "When he detected my gaze locked onto his motionless left hand, as you can see, I'm steadying myself with my left hand in order to raise my right." 8. Apart from their bizarre denials, these patients are otherwise mentally healthy and intelligent human beings. But no amount of cross-examination can persuade them of what's plainly true, that their left arms are paralyzed. They will confabulate and rationalize and forge counterfeit reasons until they're blue in the face. Meanwhile, the rest of us, healthy, whole-brained people, are confronted every day with questions that ask us to explain our behavior. Why did you storm out of the meeting? Why did you break up with your boyfriend? Why haven't you done the dishes? Why did you vote for Barack Obama? Why are you a Christian? Each of these questions demands a reason, and in most cases we dutifully oblige. But how many of our explanations are legitimate, and how many are counterfeit? Just how pervasive is our tendency to rationalize? Introducing the press secretary. We need to be careful about drawing abrupt conclusions from research on brain-damaged subjects. The fact that stroke victims and split-brain patients confabulate doesn't necessarily imply that healthy, whole-brained humans do the same. The brain is an intricate organ, and it's no surprise that destroying some of its parts, whether by stroke or by surgery, can cause it to behave strangely, to do things it was never designed to do. So what is the brain designed to do? Well, what Gazzaniga concludes from his years of research, including later work on healthy patients, is that all human brains contain a system he calls the interpreter module. The job of this module is to interpret or make sense of our experiences by constructing explanations, stories that integrate information about the past and present, and about oneself and the outside world. This interpreter works to the best of its abilities given the information available to it. So in whole-brain patients, when information is flowing freely between the two hemispheres, the explanations produced by the interpreter typically make a lot of sense. But how many of our explanations are legitimate, and how many are counterfeit? Just how pervasive is our tendency to rationalize? Introducing the press secretary. We need to be careful about drawing abrupt conclusions from research on brain-damaged subjects. The fact that stroke victims and split-brain patients confabulate doesn't necessarily imply that healthy, whole-brained humans do the same. The brain is an intricate organ, and it's no surprise that destroying some of its parts, whether by stroke or by surgery, can cause it to behave strangely, to do things it was never designed to do. So what is the brain designed to do? Well, what Gazzaniga concludes from his years of research, including later work on healthy patients, is that all human brains contain a system he calls the interpreter module. The job of this module is to interpret or make sense of our experiences by constructing explanations, stories that integrate information about the past and present, and about oneself and the outside world. This interpreter works to the best of its abilities given the information available to it. So in whole-brain patients, when information is flowing freely between the two hemispheres, the explanations produced by the interpreter typically make a lot of sense. But when the information flow breaks down, whether because of brain damage or any other reason, the interpreter is forced to weave more tenuous, inventive explanations, or even whole-cloth fabrications. The key question regarding the interpreter is this: for whom does it interpret? Is it for an internal audience, that is, the rest of the brain, or for an external audience, that is, other people? The answer is both, but the outward-facing function is surprisingly important and often underemphasized. This has led many thinkers, including Dan Dennett, Jonathan Haidt, and Robert Kurzban, to give the interpreter module a more memorable name, the press secretary. Box 6, Press Secretary. When we capitalize press secretary, we're referring to the brain module responsible for explaining our actions, typically to third parties. The lowercase version of press secretary refers to the job held by someone in relation to a president or prime minister. The idea here is that there's a structural similarity between what the interpreter module does for the brain and what a traditional press secretary does for a president or prime minister. Here's Haidt from The Righteous Mind. If you want to see post hoc reasoning in action, just watch the press secretary of a president or prime minister take questions from reporters. No matter how bad the policy, the secretary will find some way to praise or defend it. Reporters then challenge assertions and bring up contradictory quotes from the politician, or even quotes straight from the press secretary on previous days. Sometimes you'll hear an awkward pause as the secretary searches for the right words, but what you'll never hear is, "Hey, that's a great point. Maybe we should rethink this policy." Press secretaries can't say that because they have no power to make or revise policy. They're simply told what the policy is, and their job is to find evidence and arguments that will justify the policy to the public. 10 press secretaries, along with their corporate cousins, public relations teams, fill an interesting niche at the boundary between organizations and the outside world. They're close enough to the actual decision makers to be privy to some important details, but not close enough to get the full scoop. In fact, many press secretaries excel at their jobs with remarkably little contact with the president. 11. Crucially, however, when talking to the press, they don't differentiate between answers based on privileged information and answers that are mere educated guesses. They don't say, "I think this is what the administration is doing." They speak authoritatively, like the left hemisphere of the split-brain patient who declared, "I wanted to go get a Coke." In fact, press secretaries actively exploit this ambiguity, hoping their educated guesses will be taken for matters of fact. Their job is to give explanations that are sometimes genuine and sometimes counterfeit, and to make it all but impossible for their audiences to tell the difference. Press secretaries also provide a buffer between the president and reporters probing for sensitive, potentially damaging information. Remember how knowledge can sometimes be dangerous? Press secretaries can use strategic ignorance to their advantage in ways that a president, who must typically remain informed, can't. In particular, what press secretaries don't know, they can't accidentally betray to the press. "I do my best work," says William Bailey, the fictional press secretary on TV's The West Wing, "when I'm the least informed person in the room." This is what makes the role of press secretaries so hazardous, epistemically if not also morally. It's structured to deliver counterfeit explanations, but also to make those explanations hard to detect, which is as close as you can get without actually lying. Press secretaries and public relations teams exist in the world because they're incredibly useful to the organizations that employ them. They're a natural response to the mixed motive incentives that organizations face within their broader ecosystems. And the argument that Kurzban, Dennett, and others have made is that our brains respond to the same incentives by developing a module analogous to a president's press secretary. Above all, it's the job of our brain's press secretary to avoid acknowledging our darker motives, to tiptoe around the elephant in the brain. Just as a president's press secretary should never acknowledge that the president is pursuing a policy in order to get reelected or to appease his financial backers, our brain's press secretary will be reluctant to admit that we're doing things for purely personal gain, especially when that gain may come at the expense of others. To the extent that we have such motives, the press secretary would be wise to remain strategically ignorant of them. What's more, and this is where things might start to get uncomfortable, there's a very real sense in which we are the press secretaries within our minds. In other words, the parts of the mind that we identify with, the parts we think of as our conscious selves, are the ones responsible for strategically spinning the truth for an external audience. This realization flies in the face of common sense. In everyday life, there's a strong bias toward treating the self as the mind's ultimate decision-maker, the iron-fisted monarch, or what Dennett calls the mind's boss or central executive. 12. As Harry Truman said about his presidency, the buck stops here, and we often imagine the same is true of the self. But the conclusion from the past 40 years of social psychology is that the self acts less like an autocrat and more like a press secretary. In many ways, its job, our job, isn't to make decisions, but simply to defend them. You are not the king of your brain, says Stephen Koss. You are the creepy guy standing next to the king going, a most judicious choice, sire. In other words, even we don't have particularly privileged access to the information and decision-making that goes on inside our minds. We think we're pretty good at introspection, but that's largely an illusion. In a way, we're almost like outsiders within our own minds. Perhaps no one understands this conclusion better than Timothy Wilson, a social psychologist who's made a long career studying the perils of introspection. Starting with an influential paper published in 197713 and culminating in his book Strangers to Ourselves, published in 2002, Wilson has meticulously documented how shockingly little we understand about our own minds. Wilson writes about the adaptive unconscious, the parts of the mind which lie outside the scope of conscious awareness, but which nevertheless give rise to many of our judgments, emotions, thoughts, and even behaviors. To the extent that people's responses are caused by the adaptive unconscious, writes Wilson, they do not have privileged access to the causes and must infer them. He goes on. Despite the vast amount of information people have, their explanations about the causes of their responses are no more accurate than the explanations of a complete stranger who lives in the same culture. Point 14. This, then, is the key sleight of hand at the heart of our psychosocial problems. We pretend we're in charge, both to others and even to ourselves, but we're less in charge than we think. We pose as privileged insiders, when in fact we're often making the same kind of educated guesses that any informed outsider could make. We claim to know our own minds, when, as Wilson says, we're more like strangers to ourselves. The upshot is that every time we give a reason, there's a risk we're just making things up. Every because clause, every answer to a why question, every justification or explanation of a motive, every one of these is suspect. Not all will turn out to be rationalizations, but any of them could be, and a great many are. Sneaking past the gatekeeper. For those of us who want to understand what's really going on in our minds, the press secretary module poses a problem. It acts as a gatekeeper, an information broker, helping the rest of the brain conceal its secrets by presenting the most positive, defensible face to the outside world. We'd like to peer inside the mind, to understand what the administration is up to, but the press secretary controls so much of the information flow, and it's a notorious spin doctor. Our challenge in this chapter, then, as well the rest of the book, is to sneak past the gatekeeper, 15, to catch a glimpse of what's really going on in the mind. Behind the press secretary's smokescreen, we've already seen one fruitful approach, studying split-brain patients and stroke victims. In such patients, the press secretary is partially incapacitated, cut off from vital sources of information that would normally be available to it. But there's another time-honored approach to sneaking past the gatekeeper, misdirecting it. One of the striking facts about social psychology is how many experiments rely on an element of misdirection. It's almost as if the entire field is based on the art of distracting the press secretary in order to expose its rationalizations. In one classic study, researchers sent subjects home with boxes of 3 different laundry detergents and asked them to evaluate which worked best on delicate clothes. Point 16. All 3 detergents were identical, though the subjects had no idea. Crucially, however, the three boxes were different. One was a plain yellow, another blue, and the third was blue with splashes of yellow. In their evaluations, subjects expressed concerns about the first two detergents and showed a distinct preference for the third. They said that the detergent in the yellow box was too strong and that it ruined their clothes. The detergent in the blue box, meanwhile, left their clothes looking dirty. The detergent in the third box, however, had a fine and wonderful effect on their delicate clothes. Here again, as in the split brain experiments, we know what's really going on. The subjects simply preferred the blue and yellow box. But because they were asked to evaluate the detergents, and because they thought the detergents were actually different, their press secretaries were tricked into making up counterfeit explanations. Analogous studies involving other products, like wine and pantyhose, have found similar results. 17. The experimental deception in all these studies is the same. An identical product is presented as many different products in order to measure how suggestible people are to packaging, presentation, brand, and other framing effects. In each case, the press secretary makes up reasons it thinks are legitimate. Oh, this wine is a lot sweeter, or these pantyhose are so smooth. But since the products are identical, we know the reasons must be rationalizations. 18. In an even more deceptive experiment, researchers showed male subjects pairs of photos of female faces. For each pair, the subjects were asked to point to the face they found more attractive. What the subjects didn't realize is that, after they pointed to their chosen photograph, the researcher used sleight of hand to slip them the other photograph, the one they didn't choose. The subjects were then asked to explain their choice. Not only did a clear majority of participants fail to notice the switch, but after being given the wrong photograph, they often proceeded to give concrete and specific reasons for their choice. She looks like an aunt of mine, I think, and she seems nicer than the other one. Or she's radiant. I would rather have approached her at a bar than the other one. I like earrings. Even under the best conditions, unlimited time to make the choice, pairs of women with different hair colors or styles, the subjects realized they had been deceived only about a third of the time. In most trials, the subject's press secretary was perfectly happy to rationalize a decision the subject didn't actually make. Point 19. Another technique involves detecting counterfeit reasons statistically. Here the idea is to split people into two groups, vary a parameter or two between the groups, then notice how the groups give conflicting reasons for their behavior. Richard Nisbet and Timothy Wilson gave a great demonstration of this technique in the 1977 study we mentioned earlier. Subjects were split into two groups. Each group watched a short video of a teacher with a foreign accent, then rated the teacher's overall likability as well as his appearance, mannerisms, and accent. The only difference between the two groups was the way the teacher related to his students. In one group, he was warm and friendly, in the other group, cold and hostile. Otherwise, his appearance, mannerisms, and accent were the same. Subjects in the warm condition obviously liked the teacher more, and, because of the halo effect, they also rated his other attributes higher. But when subjects were asked whether the teacher's overall likability had influenced their judgments about his other attributes, they strongly denied it. In fact, many of them said it was the other way around, that it was the teacher's appearance, mannerisms, and accent that determined whether they liked him. In other words, subjects couldn't see that it was actually the teacher's behavior that had influenced their judgments, and so instead many of them made up bogus explanations for how they had formed their opinions. Point 20. Rationalization in real life. We've seen how to catch rationalizations in the lab. Now our task is to spot this kind of behavior in the wild. Let's start with a simple case involving Kevin's nephew Landon. Here's the scene. It's 8 p.m. and time for Landon to go to bed. He's 3 years old and in the midst of potty training. His mom asks if he needs to use the toilet before tucking him in for the night. Landon says no, so she gives him a kiss, turns out the light, and shuts the door. 5 minutes later he calls out, "Mommy, I need to go potty." She takes him to the bathroom and then back to bed. But 5 minutes later he's calling again, "Mommy, I need to go potty." At this point, we can roll our eyes. Clearly Landon doesn't need to use the bathroom, and he's far from alone in this behavior. On parenting forums, some moms even describe perfectly potty-trained children who, after being denied their third or fourth consecutive bathroom request, will wet themselves to prove how serious they are. But they aren't fooling anyone. No one with a healthy bladder needs to pee that frequently. Instead, these toddlers simply don't want to go to sleep. That's their true motive, and they're using potty as a bedtime stalling tactic. It's an excuse, a pretext, a counterfeit reason. Adults, of course, are more cunning about their counterfeit reasons, and it's commensurately harder to catch them in the act. Adult press secretaries are highly trained professionals, their skills honed through years of hard experience. Above all, they know how to give rationalizations that are plausible. And thus when we are faced with a suspicious reason, it's almost impossible to prove that it's counterfeit. Remember, people are often convinced they're telling the truth, and they'll sometimes go to great lengths to prove it, not unlike a toddler wetting herself to prove that her bathroom need was legitimate. We, your two co-authors, can also give examples from our own lives. Robin, for example, has often said his main goal in academic life is to get his ideas out there in the name of intellectual progress. But then he began to realize that whenever he spotted his ideas out there without proper attribution, he had mixed feelings. In part, he felt annoyed and cheated. If his main goal was actually to advance the world's knowledge, he should have been celebrating the wider circulation of his ideas, whether or not he got credit for them. But the more honest conclusion is that he wants individual prestige just as much as, if not more than, impersonal intellectual progress. Shortly after his 23rd birthday, Kevin was diagnosed with Crohn's disease. For a while he was extremely reluctant to talk about it, a reluctance he rationalized by telling himself that he's simply a private person who doesn't like sharing private medical details with the world. Later he started following a very strict diet to treat his disease, a diet that eliminates processed foods and refined carbohydrates. Eating so healthy quickly became a point of pride, and suddenly Kevin found himself perfectly happy to share his diagnosis, since it also gave him an opportunity to brag about his diet. Being a private person about medical details went right out the window, and now, look, here he is sharing his diagnosis with perfect strangers in this book. These two examples illustrate one of the most effective ways to rationalize, which is telling half-truths. In other words, we cherry-pick our most acceptable, pro-social reasons while concealing the uglier ones. Robin really does want to get his ideas out there, and Kevin really is a private person. But these two explanations aren't the full story. To identify other examples, we'll have to relax our standards of proof. It's hard to accuse a particular reason of being counterfeit. That's the whole point. We can never be perfectly certain, but here we appeal to our readers' common sense and lived experience. We all know that this happens. And even if some of these examples aren't airtight, we hope they'll give the general flavor of how people use and abuse reasons. Parents will often enforce kids' bedtimes for their own good, when a self-serving motive seems just as likely, that parents simply want an hour or two of peace and quiet without the kids. Of course, many parents genuinely believe that bedtimes are good for their children, but that belief is self-serving enough that we should be skeptical that it's the full story. Minor impediments are often exaggerated to avoid unwanted social encounters. I'm not feeling well today as an excuse not to go work, for example, or I'm too busy to decline a meeting. Typically there's a grain of truth to these reasons, but it's often exaggerated, and meanwhile other reasons are conveniently omitted. People who download copyrighted material, songs, movies, books, often rationalize their actions by saying, faceless corporations take most of the profits from artists anyway. The fact that most of these people wouldn't dream of stealing CDs or DVDs from Best Buy attests to a different explanation for their behavior, which is that online, they feel anonymous and are less afraid of getting caught. The point is, we have many reasons for our behaviors, but we habitually accentuate and exaggerate our pretty, pro-social motives and downplay our ugly, selfish ones. Point 21. Getting our bearings. So far in this book, our focus has been mostly theoretical. We've tried to explain why we often hide our motives, even from ourselves, but merely knowing that hidden motives exist doesn't tell us how widespread they are, nor how big are their effects. For that, we have to turn outward to our behavior and institutions. In the chapters that follow, we'll examine many different areas of life. For each area, we'll suggest that our visible motives, the usual motives we claim to have, don't seem adequate to explain our behaviors, and that other quite different motives often explain our behaviors better. As you read the chapters that make up part 2 of this book, feel free to jump around. Each chapter stands more or less on its own, so you can read what interests you and skip what doesn't. To recap the relevant section from the table of contents. Chapter 7. Body Language Chapter 8. Laughter Chapter 9. Conversation Chapter 10. Consumption Chapter 11. Art Chapter 12. Charity Chapter 13. Education Chapter 14. Medicine Chapter 15. Religion Chapter 16. Politics. For better or worse, this book is extremely wide-ranging. In most of the fields we discuss, we, your two co-authors, are relative amateurs. We've tried our best to learn the relevant literature, but we could only read so much. No doubt we're missing a lot of important information. Most of our claims, therefore, and especially the controversial ones, are taken from experts in each field. Of course, we realize that a few expert opinions don't necessarily reflect a consensus among all experts, nor, it should be noted, is consensus opinion necessarily the truth. If we seem to have selectively chosen our sources and evidence, then it's probably because we have. So we are no doubt wrong in many places, not just in the details, but also in some larger conclusions. Our main goal is to demonstrate that hidden motives are common and important, that they're more than a minor correction to the alternate theory that people mostly do things for the reasons that they give. For this purpose, we don't need to be right about everything. In fact, we expect most readers to buy only about 70% of what we're selling, and we're okay with that. Where we're lacking in perspective, we expect that others will widen our view and point out our mistakes. But we hope our overall thesis can withstand these individual corrections. That said, let's now set out to investigate specific behaviors and institutions. Starting with body language. Part 2. Hidden motives in everyday life.